development and direction. Only when we are able to create an active culture of thinking and debating on the left, without it proving prematurely divisive, can we begin to imagine a leftist politics adequate to the historical possibilities of our moment. We may not know what these possibilities for transformation are yet. This is why we think it is imperative to create avenues of engagement that will support these efforts. Towards this goal, Platypus will be hosting a series of roundtable discussions with organizers and participants of Occupy. These will start at campuses in New York, in Chicago, in Boston, and in Philadelphia, but will be moving to other North American cities and overseas to London, Germany, Greece, India, and South Korea in the months to come. These are places where there are Platypus chapters and efforts. We will welcome anyone and all who would like to be a part of this project of self-education and potential rebuilding of the left to join us in advancing this critical moment. The panelists were given a set of questions. Those are also in the pamphlet, so their introductory remarks will somehow try to grapple with these questions. Platypus was started in 2006 by a group of students in the School of the Art Institute of Chicago and the University of Chicago. We started as a reading group and became an organization in order to put together such public fora, such as these, and to put out a monthly newspaper, which you can find in the back, and it's free. The newspaper, I should say, is not representative of the opinions of Platypus members. It's an open forum, the same way in which our discussions are an open forum, and so they represent the different individuals we've invited and sought out to participate and to write about a particular topic or another. The slogan there, "The left is dead, long live the left," is an attempt to open up spheres of transformative possibilities. What does it mean that the kind of transformation that we seek is not happening today? What does it mean that a kind of emancipatory politics and this opening up of transformation is not present with us? So we declare the left dead in order to start again, in order to think about the left. That's the slogan. There are a couple of images here, but I think this is running a bit slow, so I'll push forward, and I don't want to delay, but the images that will come up are just posters of events that we've done in the past. This one was during the anti-war movement. When the group got started, we hosted an event on imperialism in which we invited different folks to speak on the issue of imperialism, anti-imperialism from the different political organizations and individuals that we saw present at the anti-war protests. The next sort of political phase, at least in my generation, is the Obama moment, in which the death knell of the anti-war movement signaled a kind of increased campaigning for the Democratic Party. So some of the same individuals that we saw during the anti-war movement actually had begun to campaign for the Democratic Party. So we thought we wanted to host a conversation with some of these folks, including people from the Students for a Democratic Society, like Pat Corte, who is on the panel. And we've done several other fora, but I think these are sort of highlights about show the practice that we do, which is hosting the conversation on the left, which is what we would like to be doing today. So without further ado, I should say, and I wrote on the program as well, although these folks are part of different working groups, they're not going to be speaking for those working groups. They are individuals within this process, and so we welcome those even in the audience who may be part of the same working groups, who have very different opinions, to come join us for conversation. So that said, some brief introductions. So all the way there to my left, Jordan. Jordan has been at Occupy Wall Street for about 4 weeks. At OWS, he has served as a facilitator for the General Assembly and has focused on sanitation and mediation. Next to him is Phil. Phil is a grad student at NYU's Draper Interdisciplinary Program, of which I'm also a part of, active in the anti-globalization movement and the anti-war movement of the 2000s, and has worked on issues of labor and immigration. Next to him is Laura. And she has worked on issues of anti-imperialism, art, and activism, and writes for several publications, including the Looking Glass magazine and the Leftist Review. Laura is part of the OWS Alternative Economies Working Group. Next to her is Jack Rabbit. He began his political work as an anarchist in Philadelphia in the late 80s, where he was a squatter and volunteered at the Wooden Shoe Info Shop for many years. Currently, he is a member of the Politics and Electoral Reform Working Group at OWS, and is involved with the Inter-Occupation Communication Initiative being developed at OWS. Next to him is Lisa, who has been active in the anti-war protest and community health and activism, LGBT rights, and a variety of other causes in the late 1980s. She co-authored a book by the title of The First Year of Hepatitis C, An Essential Guide for the Newly Diagnosed, and 3 other nonfiction books. Lisa is a member of the OWS Education and Empowerment and Think Tank working groups. And last but not least is Chris. He's a public librarian in Brooklyn, a rank-and-file activist in DC 37, Local 1482, and chair of the New York City Local of Democratic Socialist of America. And Chris is part of the OWS Demands Working Group. Okay, great. The event will go as follows. We'll have some brief introductory remarks. Then we'll allow the panelists to respond, and I'll try to raise some questions as well. And then we'll open it up for Q&A. Thanks.
Well, I can just start now?
Go for it.
Great. Can everyone hear me? Awesome.
Because of recording?
Oh, okay, use the microphone. Okay. So I'm not used to using microphones, so. And everyone can still hear me all good, right? Great. So can I just see a show of hands of how many people here feel like you have a good grasp of what's going on down there? I only halfway raised my hand because I kind of do. Okay. Great. So I guess I'll just talk a little bit about why I'm there and then respond to some of these questions that were in here. Good questions. So I could spend hours and hours explaining why I'm at Occupy Wall Street, but I think the fundamental reason why I'm there and why I think a lot of people are there, or I'll just speak for myself, the fundamental reason why I'm there is that I feel like what we're trying to create at Occupy Wall Street is a model for a community to exist that is based fundamentally on compassion and respect for each other, as opposed to fear and insecurity of each other. So I think, in my opinion, the larger United States society, we develop a lot of fear and insecurity towards each other, and what we're trying to create here is a situation that is fundamentally different than that. And so I think that we build that through the process that we use to make decisions, which is this consensus process. Does anyone, can you raise your hand if you feel like you understand what I'm talking about when I say consensus? So there's different levels of understanding. So the idea is that we collectively make decisions and that we don't vote on things, but we have a big group discussion and everyone's concerns are incorporated into the group. And so we try to arrive at decisions where everybody supports the decision, or at least nobody has a major moral qualm with that decision. That's kind of the basis of consensus, and what the foundation of that process is just people having conversations with each other about what their society should look like, right? So I feel like the model that we have in our society today is really based on us being very passive, where we outsource our decision making to elected representatives, right? And in my understanding of that situation, our elected representatives are more influenced by people who have lots of money than by the people who vote for them. So I don't see it, I'm not really satisfied with that. I think consensus is a lot slower and messier, but I like it better because I feel like it's more representative and it's more based on us really engaging and making decisions about things. So if you want food, for instance, if you want the food working group to do a certain thing, you can, in the traditional model, you can elect a representative to go to food and deal with it, or you can just go to food, you can go to the meeting and be directly involved. So does that make sense, what I'm saying? I've seen a lot of faces staring at me. All right, cool. Anyway, so I guess the fundamental aspects of it are some ideas this idea of mutual aid. So we're doing things out of respect for each other and doing things to build this together. Direct involvement in what's going on and a sense of personal responsibility, right? So if I want the food working group to do something, I'm not going to tell them what to do. I'm just going to go to food and talk to them about that and try to make that thing happen. To speak to some of these questions, the demands issue has been something that I've thought a lot about. And I think it's great that we don't have any demands. And I think that for us to develop demands at this point would be really problematic for two main reasons. One, I don't think we are the 99% right now because we haven't developed our dialogue enough, right? There's not enough people who are having that dialogue with us, so we can't like come up with a representative set of ideas until we have like general assemblies all across New York, and those are coming together in like a council of general assemblies to decide on something. I also think that demands, when you make a demand, you cede your power to who you are demanding whatever you're demanding from. So if we make a bunch of demands, we're saying, okay, we demand that you do this for us. And now that we've made that demand, we have this expectation for you to fulfill that demand for us. I have zero faith in our politicians to do anything other than try to get elected. I believe that's the bottom line that drives our political process. So I don't want to make demands of them because that's like what they're heavily influenced by. So I think rather than cede that power, it's about us developing our own power and building it person by person. Like I'd like to see a community where everyone who's involved in that community is involved in the decision making about what happens within that community. So I guess I would say I'm firmly anti demands at Occupy Wall Street. And speaking about what success would look like for Occupy Wall Street, I think that every day that we use the consensus decision-making process, we are succeeding, and I think that we just have to keep showing up and using that process. What we're doing is fundamentally different from what's going on here has existed in other settings before, but it's fundamentally different from anything that I've been a part of, and I think it's fundamentally different from a lot of things that we've seen in the United States, especially recently and like appealing on such a broad scale. So I think it's going to take a long time for it to get all figured out. But I think for me, success would be like a bunch of general assemblies for each neighborhood in Manhattan, and then, you know, for each neighborhood in every borough, and then having a council of those general assemblies making decisions about what goes on in New York. That for me would be success. And it's, like I said, it's an ongoing process, and I still think we're extremely young at this point, and still in the position of building and doing outreach and just talking to people and trying to involve people in this dialogue. So I guess that's all I have to say as far as opening remarks. Am I cool on time?
Oh yeah, that's fine. You want to say something else?
Sure, I like to talk.
You have about a minute.
I have about a minute, great. Okay, so the differences between Occupy movement and the anti-WTO protests in Seattle. I was not a part of those. I was in middle school when those were happening. But I guess the fundamental difference is that those are targeted against a specific summit. And so we had summit-based movements like the anti-WTO in Seattle, anti-WTO in Miami, anti-WTO in Cancun. Those are all specific summit that we're trying to shut down. And some of those were very successful, like Seattle and Cancun were very successful. But I think what we're doing here is we're focused on shutting things down, but we're also focused on building things up at the same time. And thus far, we haven't seen a lot of property destruction from our group, and I think that that is a good thing right now, at least, because it allows us to continue to reach larger audiences, and we're also taking into account that the media controls our image, and if anything like that happens, they will label us in one way, and they have the power to do that. So anyway, I guess that's my opening remarks.
All right, hello everyone, can you all hear me? My name is Phil, like Pam said. I've been active in progressive and left-wing movements since I was a teenager. Like Jordan, I was also in middle school when Seattle happened, but that was still definitely a really big waking up moment for me personally, which is part of the reason why that first question, like, was such a challenge to me directly that, I personally feel like a lot of the reasons why I'm here today originated in like those moments in Seattle and in the aftermath of the 2000 election, and seeing like, the workers and students of Serbia unite together to overthrow Slobodan Milosevic, and within a month of us installing Bush as president in a stolen election, right? So I feel like, a lot of those things really came together, like what happened specifically in Seattle, and then, another country, another campaign of civil disobedience and nonviolent resistance, because I do think Seattle was still, in the end, nonviolent fundamentally. But what really sets us apart, I think, from Seattle is the fact that, like Jordan was saying, is Seattle was very narrowly focused in time. It was very temporally concentrated. By the time like most of us really knew what was happening in Seattle, the chance to get involved in any meaningful way with that demonstration had already passed. It was far away, and so if you didn't live in the Seattle area, there's nothing you could do to show up to. There's almost no time to plan solidarity demonstrations, although granted I was in middle school, so I missed probably most of those that did occur. But here and I spent my the past decade of my life trying to figure out how to cause some kind of civil disobedience in a mass fashion, right? And it had never really occurred to me until we started doing it that the thing you need to do is you just need a protest that never stops. That tactic is very fundamentally different from what we've done before. It brings back the power of, the sit-in occupations of the 30s, of, the kind of activities that like the Wobblies would do, where they would, set up their own lumber campsites and really create these alternative societies that exist and endure, even if it's not permanent, but still are enduring longer than just a few days. It gives it a time for people to really realize exactly how serious and how profound what we are talking about and what we are arguing about really is. That, like at first, you can see that in the media's changing, narrative that they like to use. First, we were just a bunch of dirty anarchists and hippies who were going to go away once we got bored, and then we were a bunch of privileged young college students who were unemployed and lazy, and that's why we had the time to sit out in a park, And now we keep having people with children, we have retirees there, we have people of color, we're not the 99% yet, like Jordan said, but we are getting better. We're getting more diverse. You can't go down to Liberty Plaza these days and say it's just a bunch of, white hippies and anarchists. And I don't think it ever really was at the beginning. Even if we're the foot soldiers of a lot of revolutions, the young people anyway. And so, and that also sort of brings me to the next question that they had too, right? To what degree is this movement like based against capitalism? To what extent is this a part of the class war? And one critique I always had is a part of the like AntiGlobalization movement, and maybe just it's the fact that it never took off that I feel this. I never felt like it really took off, or at least while I was involved in it. It was always, a few hundred or a few thousand of us at most involved in any given demonstration. But we never really seemed to click a like level of class consciousness amongst the people in America anyway. The people that my experience was actively reaching out and working with. Our issues always seem to be focused globally, and it's not that those issues aren't important or that those struggles aren't 100% valid and necessary, but for whatever reason, there just wasn't a click that was going on. And I think that there's been something unique that's happened in the past 3 years in America, where we had the financial crisis and we had the election of a president that promised change, even if, most of us in this room probably didn't expect a whole lot of change to come. That wasn't... The fact that we had those expectations that were then crashed, I feel like it's given a lot of people in this generation, or that are alive now, a more critical and reflective approach to American politics than we've had in in a couple generations at least since the 60s. I don't think in 2000 or in 99 we were in that moment. I think that's why we all watched Bush steal an election and nobody and, no great numbers of people went pouring out into the streets, or why, I'm sure many of us have been a part of countless demonstrations in the last 10 years, and why none of them turned into this, ongoing, civil insurrection almost. And, in our final direction, I feel like we've achieved this class consciousness that's sort of been forced upon us, even if most Americans weren't immediately willing to absorb these lessons. It's like you can't look around the world over the past 3 years and not just see how stark it is. Even though I know I always thought it was really stark and self-evident to begin with, but I personally probably am more anti-capitalist than most of the people down there, and I'll fully admit that, like me as a person. And that's one of the interesting things I think we'll start seeing as this movement develops is, are we going to be able to start winning initial demands that we might perhaps make? That are we going to start seeing any kind of minor campaigns coming out, and what the response of the system will be? Right now the system's response has been basically to try to ignore us, to marginalize us, and to crack down on us. And other places and other societies where they've tried that route, it tends to lead to a radicalization of the movement. And we're starting to see that kind of thing happening now. I remember the protests 4 weeks ago were much more timid than they are now. And I don't mean that we're violent, because we're still totally nonviolent. We're still amazingly self-disciplined, but we're not scared of the police anymore. I noticed, 4 weeks ago when we were told to get off the street, we would get off the street and walk back to the sidewalk, 2 weeks ago from today, I was at the demonstration on Wall Street in the morning that we did not get evicted, and the NYPD charged us on mopeds over a dozen times because we wouldn't get off the street. And every time they charged us, we parted ways and then took the street after they had passed through us, And so there's this level of fear that we're starting to lose. And I think that is going to be our biggest defense when it comes to reaching out to other more mainstream progressive movements and institutions like labor unions, like community associations, because I do think we had something like this starting up back in February in Madison, and I'm pretty sure a lot of you were as jazzed up and excited as I was then. And then you all were probably wondering, like me, what happened when all of a sudden it seemed like we were going to stop protesting and go to this recall election that, surprise, surprise, didn't work out. We all went, or we didn't, but the Democrats got control of the movement, steered it to the ends that were safe to them and safe to the system, and it went nowhere. And sorry.
So no, that's okay. I was just going to ask you, maybe the way in which you could wrap up just so we can keep people going, is by answering what would it mean for this movement to be successful? Yeah,
so what this movement needs to be successful is we need to avoid that co-opting by mainstream groups. And what we really need to do is do what has never happened in America before. We need to build bridges between races and classes that are separated by this racist, sexist, classist system we live in. And no system, not the labor movement, or no movement, not the labor movement, not the civil rights movement, ever really built a bridge that united the white working and white middle classes with people of color, from middle classes, from working classes, with immigrants. And what we are doing and what we're starting to get there is the very beginnings of this. We're only a month old, so it can only, people are just putting their toes in the water, so to speak. But I think that's why the system is decided to respond with cracking down, because they're seeing people from very wide walks of life who never before in our society have ever worked together for the same political goals. And so that's personally what keeps me going in all of this, too.
Hi, my name is Laura Schleifer. I want to say before I say anything else that I'm very happy to have a mic and you can all hear me, because I'm very, very glad that nobody has to repeat me to hear me. So that's a big luxury, being in an enclosed space with a microphone. I'm going to start with this idea of why I'm involved with Occupy Wall Street and why I think that it's important to be involved. I think it's interesting because that was actually a question that was posed to everyone the very first day of the occupation. And so we kind of all sat in a circle, and, everybody kind of went around, and they said, oh, I'm here because of this reason, I'm here because of that reason. And it got to me, and I said, well, I've been an activist my whole entire life. I can't really remember any time, even when I was a small child, when I wasn't actively doing things, for the better of the world, whether it was with an organization or it was individually. But something that's kind of changed is that, up until now, I think for a lot of American activists, there was kind of always this sense of, oh, I have to defend somebody else's rights that are under attack. Our government is, bombing another country, invading another country. Our government is, whatever it is. Oh, and then I can talk about like with, the corporation that is exploiting workers in, XYZ developing world country. And so, there was kind of always this sense of, we have to stand up for their rights. I said, but at this stage, I said, this is not just about that. This is now about defending your own life. I said, because our lives are under direct attack, and this is do or die at this stage. And so it's really to the extent where every aspect of our lives is under such an onslaught of attack that the question shouldn't be, why are you involved with this? The question would be, why are you not involved with this? Because there is absolutely no way that you live in this society, unless you are part of that 1%, that you are not being directly attacked and cornered to the point where you are just squeezed out. So that's the first point I want to make. Now, going into some of these questions, and starting with kind of the differences between Seattle, the anti-globalization movement and Occupy Wall Street. I want to kind of go into that actually from my other point, which is that I do feel that we have a very different backdrop at the moment to what the anti-globalization demonstrators were dealing with, because the things that, only hyper-conscious or hyper-informed people were just becoming aware of or just beginning to sense were wrong in the world, I think, really virtually everyone is sensing now. Everyone is feeling a sense of being dependent on a system that is doomed, and that there is just, we're all like on a sinking ship, basically. And so there's like this overall sense of we have to jump ship, and we have to build something new, because this is not going to get better. I think that's a pretty universal sense across the political spectrum. So that's one thing I wanted to bring up. Another thing is that the Occupy Wall Street movement actually has had a chance to have a base, and because of that, we've had a chance to build a living community. Some other people said, yes, that the anti-globalization movement was very direct, action-oriented. And I wouldn't say that it was just based on these events, although that was obviously a big part of it, but even on a day-to-day basis, it was very much direct action of shutting things down, making things not function as they normally would, which I think is really, really important. But they didn't have the other side, which was, the building community. One of the most important things with building community, I'm going to go back to the Black Panthers with this, because that was what made them so successful, in part, was the fact that, while they were fighting at night, the cops, they had during the day, medical clinics, they had breakfast clinics, so this is something that I think where people that are more disenfranchised are concerned, this is something that would appeal to them, is knowing that it's not just about shutting things down, but also providing as well. So that's another thing. Now I'm going to move move on to this issue of demands that, has stirred up so much controversy. Personally, I do see the reasons behind not making specific demands, and I think that, from a broader, more philosophical perspective, I think that those reasons are very valid. However, I do think at the same time that, when you are looking into the way that this movement is being perceived by people outside the movement, there is a sense of, but you're occupying until what? And especially when you start out with a statement of, we're going to stay here until, that does demand an answer of until what? So personally, and I can't speak for the movement here, but personally, I would say that that where demands are concerned, I think that a happy medium between, very, very specific demands of we want this and we want that versus something that's just so open-ended that people don't even understand it, is to make just a few, 2 or 3 key demands that are so broad that you pretty much can encompass almost anything under those demands. So one demand that I would say is something that pretty much everyone across the board, other than the 1%, would agree with, is that we need to sever the union between corporations and politics and government. I think that this is something that affects so many different areas that, just to say this is our demand is that we want a separation between corporation and state, could cover everything from wars, imperialism, food issues, genetic modification, the private prison system, environmental issues, schools. I mean, I can keep going and going. Housing, the foreclosure crisis. I mean, there are just so many different areas here that are affected by that marriage of corporation and state. And I also think that it's something that would resonate with a lot of people in this country because it has, of course, the historical precedent of separation of church and state. So people are already familiar with this idea of, this country was founded on separation of blank and state, that there should not be this corrupting influence of an outside influence on government. So that's one thing I would say would be an important demand that, I couldn't really see that many people disagreeing with. I would say another demand that would be very broad would be direct democracy. And again, it does not matter what end of the political spectrum you're in. The point is that if this is a democracy, you should have a voice. And you should have a direct voice, and it shouldn't go through representatives that, may or may not be representing you in the slightest. And another thing that I would say is where militarism is concerned. Personally, I think that there needs to be a much stronger, clearer statement in regards to militarism, in regards to the corporate influence in all of these wars, in regards to the reasons why we're in these countries being connected to corporatism, and of course also the crash of the economy. I mean, there's a lot of focus right now on the banks and on Wall Street being the cause of the crash and of the wealthy, but I think something that is not being as discussed as much and needs to be more discussed is the influence of all the spending on military expense and how that has affected it. So these are just, again, some demands that I'm throwing out there, but I would say that, are broad enough that they might be able to be put out there and yet not be co-opted or not be specific to any one specific ideology or group of political beliefs. How much time do I have left?
We're about done.
About done? Okay.
So I just want to express my gratitude to everyone here. Very grateful for this opportunity. really glad to have the chance to speak and to hear voices, hear the voices of Occupy Wall Street, the occupations around the country, around the world. I think that this is really, as far as I'm concerned, at the very core of this is voice. I think that it's about voice. I think it's about having your voice heard in a way that you've lived your whole life without it being heard. Expecting to be heard, expecting respect for your voice. I think that, to me, is what sets this particular moment in time apart from other moments. I think that, what's so special, what I see as being so special, my experience with the Occupy Wall Street movement, the occupations, is the feeling, the sense of hope that people have. And I think that that hope comes from the sense that for the first time in their memory, that they might have an opportunity to actually be listened to. And not just listened to, but actually responded to. And I think that if you really take a look, you'll see that, no, in fact, we haven't been listened to. There's polls that have been out there for years and years and years telling the politicians who are supposed to be representing us what we want, right? We want health care. We want free education. We want to be taken care of and making sure that we can best express ourselves and be the best people that we can and give back to society. And those desires, those demands have been systematically abused and ignored. And that's why I think that the one demand that we're all looking for is the demand to have a voice and to have it be respected and listened to. That's what I think that this is really about. And that's why I think that it's so universal, because everybody wants to be heard. Because everybody has been so ignored for such a long time, because the only people that have been listened to are the super rich, and their greed is the only thing that's expressed. It's the only thing that has any voice in our society. And if you don't have that kind of money, then you're considered to be a dirty hippie who's pounding on some drums because they couldn't make it to the rainbow gathering. No, I mean, that's just like, that's just the default response. It's astounding to me to see just how blatant and how obvious that the media has really exposed themselves as defenders of the status quo by their adamant, unreasonable unwillingness to report on Occupy Wall Street, on the occupation. They've shown themselves to be nothing more than a barrier impeding us from being able to be heard. And I hate to bring it up, but the cops too have clearly shown themselves, as a whole, to be there to prevent us from feeling comfortable, expressing ourselves and protesting the way that we deserve to be able to. I cannot tell you how disgusted I was by what happened in Oakland. And if you're unfamiliar with that, then you should find out, because that was horrifying. Horrifying. That the Oakland police would open fire on peaceful protesters who are doing nothing but just expressing themselves, demanding to be heard. So anyway, I have a lot of gratitude to be able to be here in this historical moment in time. I feel like it's an unbelievable gift that we've all been provided. I'm trying to involve myself as much as possible as I can, because I think it is so precious and so important. So bring your voice. Expect respect. Right? That's what I'm saying. Providing to the disenfranchised. We're all disenfranchised. We've all been disenfranchised. I feel like in the United States and in a rich, and even especially in a rich city like New York, it's so easy for us to kind of like pass that off. I'm fine. I can still get a job. It's going to be all right. But everybody's pocket's getting picked. Everyone. And so the thing is that we're just now realizing how important it is. But, I'm going to very, very briefly talk about demands, because it's such a contentious point. I'm really, really grateful that our brother Chris is here to represent the demands group. I'm really looking forward to hearing what Chris has to say regarding demands, and thank you, Laura, for sharing that with the demands earlier. But I think that the idea that there is a particular demand outside of being heard and having your voice be respected, personally, I would have to say, definitely at this very early stage, it's not something that needs to be really that focused on. And that's because I feel like we all, our demands, like the 99%, you know, the majority of us, if we can grow and learn and understand what we really want for the first time in our lives, I feel like we will grow those demands. They won't even be demands, is what I'm trying to say, really, is that they won't be demands. They're just going to be like, you know what, we want this and we're going to have it. You know, that's what it's going to be. It's not going to be a demand. When we've won, we're not going to demand anything. We're just going to do it because that's what's right. Okay. So to me, that's what winning. That's what it looks like. So, sorry guys. So, and you know, and I want to say actually that I really hope that people speak up. I feel kind of actually very uncomfortable being at this table because I think we all have a right to talk about this and to share how we feel about this experience. I'm really grateful for the opportunity, and I also want to say that everybody deserves that voice as well. And I want to say there's so many things like the location at the site of the World Trade Center, at Wall Street. I mean, I don't know how many of you have actually had the opportunity to walk around down there. It is like a graveyard. I mean, it is amazing. At night, it's terrifying. It's like these giant gravestone buildings and these tiny little streets, and it's all dark. There's nobody around. The only thing that there is around are these, like, you know, security guards, and there's gates everywhere, and it's just like the place is so evil. It's so evil, you know. And I'm so grateful that there are people there who are just bringing life to that space to remind these evil people, you know, that we're alive and we have a voice and we're going to be heard, you know. And I have a lot of hope for that. And that's why I think that the metaphor of the people's mic is so brilliant. And if you haven't experienced it, please go be part of the GA. It's a little cold now, I know. But, you know, give it a shot. It's just incredible to hear yourself reflected in the people around you. It's beautiful. It's an amazing, amazing experience. And I think it's a brilliant metaphor for, like, you know, what I'm trying to say, which I think this movement is really about, expecting to be heard and expecting to be responded to. Have I gone on for a very long time? Because I feel like I have. Okay. Well, thank you very much for that.
Okay, I'm Lisa Montanarelli, and I want to start with a combination of the first and fifth questions because they have to do with success and defeat. And as a movement, I want us to be really cautious and also really uncompromising about the use of the word success and defeat. When we say to success and defeat, let's remember that history isn't linear, that it's not over, that the end is not in sight, and an apparent defeat can have dramatic effects years down the line. I mean, I see Occupy Wall Street as in many ways, it's a form of it's a way in which the anti-globalization movement has succeeded. But I'll come back to that. And Seattle itself was a triumph of nonviolent civil disobedience that had immediate effects, like shutting down the WTO, but I think the long-term impacts are much harder to measure. In terms of success, I think that there's a danger of wanting to be too realistic, to make, I think, a danger of making demands that are too small to try to be practical. And this is particularly, I think, a danger for activists, but anti-capitalist activists. To my mind, the consummate success would be nothing less than a global political economy based on compassion and respect, recognizing the interdependence of all living beings, caring for them all, caring for the earth. It would involve the end of capitalism, a global redistribution of wealth, relocating millions of people who now live in flood zones, spreading deserts, and other high-risk areas. And so when the vision is so distant from what the dominant political discourses in the U.S. are, there's a danger to feel constantly defeated. But, I mean, I just think of Martin Luther King, who was no less effective for having said, I may not make it to the promised land, and for kind of being, not clinging too tightly to a personal goal of realizing the world he wanted to see in his lifetime. I think that feeling that rather than feeling that we're perpetually failing to change the current system, and by the way, I don't think we are. I think that Occupy Wall Street is doing so much in terms of just being the change that we want to see in the world, to quote Gandhi and countless bumper stickers. So, because Occupy Wall Street is creating a workable communal living situation and a democratic decision-making process that would take everyone into account. And I mean, as Jordan said, whenever that happens, there is success. I think there's some important ways that the anti-globalization movement, as I said before, laid the groundwork for Occupy. And that was partly just by reinventing revolution as a very broad-based coalition. Globalizing corporations were so exploitative of labor and living beings and natural resources that, you know, basically all these different movements that had been so separate in the 70s and 80s kind of were able to bond around it. And it also turned a spotlight on corporate globalization and really brought it into it brought it to the attention of the world as a subject of debate, which it really was not before November 1999. The other thing, and I am going to sort of quote Rebecca Solnit, who's a writer I greatly admire. I'll probably misquote her, but she had this great analogy between rights and muscle tone, that when people exercise their rights, it's never defeat because we lose our rights if we don't exercise them. And there's also, I just wanted to address the role of the internet in both these movements. In 1999, the internet played a major role in organizing the WTO protests, but the mainstream media portrayed the peaceful WTO protesters as violent criminals. And after the Telecom Act of 1996 that deregulated the telecom markets, there wasn't much to correct this misrepresentation. There really were not a lot of broken windows in Seattle. There were some. There weren't the burning cop cars that I saw during the Gulf War protest. But anyway, the alternative and indie media outlets have been strangled by these huge media conglomerates that were not regulated at that point, and online citizen journalism hadn't emerged. So with the rise of the online citizen journalism, live streaming, global revolution, YouTube, it's harder to make the peaceful protesters appear violent. I mean, I think there's also been a more discipline in refraining from violence in this movement. But it's also, basically, it's been really hard to portray them other than they are, because, or to hide police brutality because we can show it to the world on YouTube, or you know, it's and the mainstream media can't really ignore it at this point. And I mean, also, I think that I can only second the points you made about being dependent on a doomed system. I think that's so clear to everyone now. And I also think that the fact that Occupy Wall Street is not a transient movement with a, you know, during a week-long summit, or a movement with an end in sight, really allows people, as Naomi Klein said, to put down roots. You know, it allows for a much more powerful, deeply rooted coalition building. Workable communal living, that was not possible with the summit protest in the late 90s, early 2000s. You know, workable communal living situation that cares for everyone, a democratic decision-making process. These are things that can only happen if you stay in one place, okay? There's really a community feel that people, I don't think, when they first went there on September 17th, expected. So is this movement anti-capitalist? Well, I am, but I think it's a broad transnational coalition of people with a variety of visions. And some of them say they're anti-capitalist and others do not. And so asking if the movement is anti-capitalist at this point is a little like saying, well, are the people who are there and saying that they don't want to dismantle the capitalism, are they just like deceiving themselves? And I mean, I myself, I will disclose that I did campaign for Obama in 2008, but I'm highly skeptical of anything that claims to be a kinder, gentler capitalism, because I believe it's inherently exploitative. It profits by getting a worker to do $50 of work and paying him $10 for that same amount. So there are always incentives to move profits to China and wherever the work is cheapest. But while I'm anti-capitalist, I also believe in relieving poverty, inequality, suffering as quickly as possible. So basically, I'm willing to form really broad coalitions with people who have different ideological perspectives. And I also know that this is what Occupy Wall Street is doing. This is what the Occupy movement is doing. And honestly, the best strategy for building broad-based coalition is to be open and flexible and not be rigid about your ideological stance, but be willing to learn, like let people express themselves, be willing to listen, not to go around saying, well, they're anti-capitalist and they just don't know it yet. So anyway, that's my take on that. I do think that Occupy Wall Street is different from most anti-capitalist movements before it, because in the US, most of the movements in recent decades have been primarily based on shared ideas. And while the Occupy Wall Street working groups are these amazing idea-generating machines, what is bringing so many people together and getting them out in the streets in Burlington, Vermont, and just all over the US and different places in the world is really shared pain, fear, and need. And when you look at the We Are the 99% Tumblr site and the signs people carry at Liberty Square and on the marches, you see that people feel like really, really stuck, really trapped, okay, and they're in massive debt, and they have no job in sight and no way out. And this is what makes it a little like the Vietnam era protest where you're being drafted and the body bags are coming home. I mean, there's this, and I also want to thank Jack Rabbit for his comment about voice, essentially. Also, like, one thing that really resonated with what Al Gore said about it being a primal scream of democracy. So the fact that Occupy Wall Street is a grab bag of issues and ideas does not bother me in the least, because the pressure for demands is a tactic to divide the movement and make everyone get out of the parks and the streets and go home. That's how I see it. It needs to form broad coalitions and spread as widely as possible right now. So I agree with other people's comments that, well, I'll put a caveat on this in a second. But I also, to quote Charles Eisenstein wrote a really eloquent piece called "No Demand is Big Enough." And I think the movement can make small demands, such as the demand to abolish the law that says corporations are people. I think, so we can demand the forgiveness of mortgage debt, student loans. But what we need to do is make it clear that we want more than that we're not going away whether or not our small demands are met, that the real demand is much, much larger and exceeds, is very much marginalized by current political reality and political discourses in the US. It's outside that. And we won't settle for something that's within that really bleak-looking reality. So to return to the beginning of my remarks about, I mentioned the Gandhi bumper sticker slogan, "To be the change," and I want to just underscore that a big part of Occupy Wall Street, as you've heard from people here, is about the decision-making process. It's about consensus. It's about a workable communal living situation that cares for everyone. It's about compassion. It's about respect. It's about love. And I've currently been facilitating meditation sessions at Occupy Wall Street. And one of the major questions that comes up in the group's discussions after those meditation sessions is just how are these several hundred people who are occupying 3/4 of an acre of cement going to create an intentional community without, replicating the class and racial divisions in New York City. One Latino occupier said to me that there was a sleep camp. I don't want to single anybody out, but it's called the Upper East Side SACS, SACKS, okay? which is hysterical in some ways, but it's also, it's sad because it's, well, you know, he was sort of saying, well, you know, the college-educated white occupiers sleep in the southwest side of Zuccotti and the Latino occupiers camp out in the northwest. And so, you know, obviously that's not always true, but it's just the questions that come up are how not to replicate the divisions, because people are really sleeping on top of each other in ways that are not very comfortable, okay? And how can that many people in that small a space get along? I mean, it's amazing that they have. So there's also just really, I think that Occupy Wall Street and the fact that it's creating this communal living situation is really putting, you know, it is creating a model for how we can live differently, how we can be different. And it's also creating a model that combines real collective activism with just working with our own minds to kind of overcome the discriminations we make so that we don't recreate what we're used to and what we've grown up with wherever we go. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Once again, I'm Chris. A number of the other panelists here have already spoken a lot about the similarities and differences between the current Occupy movement and kind of the anti or alter, whatever you want to call it, globalization movement of the late 90s and the early part of the first decade of the 2000s. But I kind of want to revisit it because I think it's really, really important to establish just exactly what the similarities and differences are. I think there are a lot of similarities between what's happening now and what happened then, and kind of many of them are spelled out in the question here. You know, Democratic president, the prominent of anarchists or anarchistic activists in the movement, the prominent presence of labor and union members in the movement. And there's also a number of other similarities that I could point to. But to me, and some of the other people have alluded to this as well, but the biggest difference is like I believe, I forget your name over there, I'm sorry, Laura, I think, pointed this out. But the biggest difference is the context. I mean, let's not forget that the 1990s witnessed the longest economic expansion in the history of the country. You know, obviously, there was a time of bubble, you know, the dot-com bubble. You know, the Verge did very well. But it was also the first time since the beginning of the neoliberal period in the late 1970s that the working class and the poor, and this includes African Americans and Latinos, actually made income gains. Those income gains were very widely distributed. And I think this is the reason why, as a number of other people have referred to, the movements of that period weren't really necessarily concerned with, say, people's self-interest here in North America. They were very concerned with international solidarity, whether or not it was the Zapatistas or acting in solidarity with the victims of structural adjustment programs and such in the Global South. And, you know, this is why the targets were the IMF, the WTO, and the World Bank. You know, institutions that were not operating here on North American soil, but operating to basically destroy the lives of others elsewhere. I don't think I need to tell you. I mean, we're living in the midst of the biggest economic crisis of capitalism since the Great Depression. I'm sure many of you have seen the CBO report that came out last week that studied income gains since the beginning of the neoliberal period in 1979 or thereabouts. You know, it really is about the top 1% against everybody else. Their share of the income in this country went up by, what was it, 275%. Whereas the income shares for most of the other parts of the population barely rose. They were very stagnant. So, yeah, people are aware of the deprivation. It's very widespread. It's affecting them personally. And people, I think in greater numbers, are coming to the awareness that we're in the midst of a massive crisis of capitalism. And that wasn't the case in the late 90s when things were actually quite good for a lot of people. And you may remember the rather annoyingly effervescent and optimistic popular culture of that period. I remember it with great dread. It was not a good time, I think, in that respect. I was in high school. I was a little older than you guys. And that brings me, I think, to the question, which I think has strangely kind of been sidestepped so far, and that's the question of whether or not this is an anti-capitalist movement. And it's interesting to me that it has been sort of sidestepped, and maybe we can come back to that when we kind of broaden this discussion a little bit. Here, I do disagree with you, actually, Lisa. I would argue that, yes, the movement is anti-capitalist, but it doesn't know it yet. Or at least that's how I feel about it today. Ask me tomorrow, I may change my mind. We're all aware that, I guess, the movement, or whatever you want to call it at this point, is very ideologically disparate. And we actually have poll data to prove that. I don't know if any of you guys have seen some of these recent polls, but a pollster who's worked for Michael Bloomberg and Bill Clinton and various other neoliberal cretins did a poll in which he basically took a bunch of data and then kind of lied about it and said that it proved that the Democrats were embracing a violent extremist movement and it would be politically toxic for them, but it doesn't actually correspond to his data, which was actually kind of, I think, very badly described and aggregated. Someone else came along and put it in, I think, a much more easily understandable format. And here's kind of the taxonomy of protesters. 8% said that they were radical in some fashion. They wanted the radical redistribution of wealth and the dissolution of our representative democracy / capitalism, or whatever I guess that means. 53% said that they were liberal. 35% of this subgroup said that they wanted to influence the Democrats the way the Tea Party has influenced the GOP. 35 of 53%. 9% said that they wanted to engage and mobilize progressives. 4% that they said they wanted single-payer health care, and 4% said they wanted to pull out of Afghanistan immediately. So this is kind of a broadly liberal to social democratic kind of tendency within the movement. 5% said that they were conservative, or you can interpret their position as conservative in some fashion, voicing support for things like the flat tax replacing the income tax. And 27% I guess could be put under the rubric of being process-oriented. And, these are the folks for whom, the idea of voice and being heard and direct democracy and so on is the most important part of the movement, which I find to be kind of interesting because that's, we hear so much about it, but at least if this poll is anything to go by, that's actually kind of a minority within the movement. And it's kind of, I think, disappointing to me in a certain respect that this kind of perspective has gained such, I guess, hegemonic status within the movement. I understand why people are very, very concerned with having their voices heard and feeling like their voices are heard. The institutions that we're part of make us feel like we have no power, that we have no say, we have no control over our lives. But I would really, really caution against getting too caught up in the idea of self-expression and having this be about self-expression. Because, self-expression, affect, our feelings, so on and so forth, this whole, I think, orientation is very easily recuperable or co-optable by capitalism, especially the kind of capitalism that we see today that to a significant extent, kind of reproduces itself by capitalizing on our affect, and such. So I would really caution against that. And I think that's kind of a segue into this kind of contentious issue of, demands and co-optation. As is noted in the program, I've been a member of the demands working group. I'm not as active as some other members because I have to work and I can't go to four-hour meetings 2 days a week, which is kind of another reason why I'm not necessarily a big fan of the consensus process or the idea that you have to be meeting and deciding about things all the time. I don't know about you guys, but I don't know. I don't want to be making all the decisions in my life. I find that to be a harrowing and terrifying prospect, but that's another story. Like I was arguing a minute ago, the folks who are saying that, demands, and especially the types of demands that have been percolating within our group, which is, a fairly, I think, radical set of demands, which would be the direct government creation of 25 million jobs, Medicare for everybody, making public higher education free, so on and so forth, and paying for these things by dramatically raising taxes on the rich and corporations and ending our involvement in all the wars that we're involved in. I've lost count of how many we're involved in. I kind of fail to see how this is a co-optable or a demand. I fail to see how something like this, which not only is directed at the state, and I think if we're going to be making demands, that's the level at which we need to pitch them, is the state, it's not just directed at the state. It's directed at those, I think, millions and millions of people out there who are heartened by the fact that we're out there in Zuccotti Park and in cities all over the country protesting Wall Street and corporate greed and what have you, but really need something more in their lives rather than just a new experience hanging out with people in a park. Again, that's why I'm leery about the argument that this kind of demand is demobilizing, demoralizing, and is co-optable. I don't really quite see it. And I think I kind of want to use that to come back to the question of whether or not it's anti-capitalist. I kind of, to tie this into the question of demands, on one level I'm kind of frustrated that this is almost taking place and that we've kind of set up this dichotomy between these kind of transitional or intermediate demands or, reforms within capitalism and the idea of a total transformation of the system. I mean, people had this argument over 100 years ago. I mean, in the Second International, communist and socialist militants fought this thing out. And I think the most perceptive and smartest of them came to the conclusion, and I agree with them, that, reform and revolution you can't counterpose them. I mean, they're part of the same process. They're dialectically connected with each other, and you can't separate them out. So on one level, I feel like this debate kind of just reflects kind of how impoverished I think our political vocabulary and our political imagination has become to a certain extent. And I think it speaks to the failure, I think, of the 20th century left to transmit its intellectual and cultural memory down to us, because I think, we wouldn't necessarily be having these kinds of arguments that have taken place, for decades and even over a century at this point. I mean, I personally, I'm a socialist, I'm a Marxist. I agree that with the folks who have argued against the formulation of demands that we should, be aiming at a total transformation, I guess, of the society. But how do I want to phrase this? And this gets back to my point about kind of the political impoverishment that I think is fairly widespread. I mean, and this gets back to the question of the demands working group. There have been a lot of people within the movement that have tried to portray the demands working group as kind of this group of socialists that wants to take control over the movement and impose its vision of what the movement should be on everyone else. It's not true. If you've heard this, it's been circulated to a significant degree by kind of the invisible anarchist vanguard behind the scenes that wants to maintain its own control over the movement, and that's incredibly frustrating. But to me, I think the role of people like us, I hope there's a lot of people like me in this room, I think the role of people like us, I think to kind of formulate what our role would be, we need to go back to this really great letter that Karl Marx wrote to one of his buddies, Arnold Ruge, in 1843. I was reminded of this letter by a really great article that my friend Peter Fraze wrote for Jacobin, which is a magazine that I write for from time to time. And in this article to his friend, Marx writes, and he's talking about the struggles of the day. Hence, nothing prevents us from making criticism of politics, participation in politics, and therefore real struggles, the starting point of our criticism, and from identifying our criticism with them. In that case, we do not confront the world in a doctrinaire way with a new principle. Here is the truth, kneel down before it. We develop new principles for the world out of the world's own principles. We do not say to the world, cease your struggles, they are foolish. We will give you the true slogan of struggle. We merely show that the world is we merely show the world what it is really fighting for. And consciousness is something that it has to acquire, even if it does not want to. So that's kind of how I conceive of the role of people like us within the movement, to be in solidarity with it, to act with it on the basis of unity, and to make whatever criticisms we have on it, of it from within the movement, but yet at the same time trying to help it become what it needs to become if it wants to, attain its goals and win success. As for success, at this point I really don't know what success would mean for this movement. I have no idea. I don't think I'm able to answer that question yet. This is also new, and I'm still trying to figure out exactly what it all means. At this point, I would be happy if we made it through the winter. we were able to kind of rally our forces for the spring and fight against the massive state and local budget cuts that are sure to be coming down the pike. And I would be happy if the spirit that kind of is infusing or animating this movement brings itself into kind of the old institutions of the left that are still around and very moribund these days, such as the labor movement, especially, in which I'm involved in. So at that point, at this point, I think that's what success would look like for me, or at least right now. But again, this is all moving so quickly, I'm not entirely sure how I feel about that. So yeah, at this point, I think it would be great to just involve everyone else in the conversation and go from there.
Okay, I want to stay on track because I want to have a bit of chunk of time to open it up for discussion. So maybe what I'll do is I'll throw some reflections out there. If anyone feels compelled to respond or to respond to each other and what has been said, we can open up for discussion in about 20 minutes, if that's okay with you all. There were a couple of things that were said that I was curious about, and some of them there were some commonalities and there were some differences across. And so I want to make one distinction, because recently there was a piece in The Guardian written by Zizek about demands. I don't know if you've seen this. And I thought that, he commits a mistake that I don't want us to commit tonight in our conversation, which is he equates ends and demands, that they're just the same thing. And that may not be the case. I think that it's a very different question to say, what are practical demands that can be made, and what are the ends of this movement, meaning what kind of social transformation would need to take place for this movement to be considered successful. Chris just said that may not be something that we can answer. We can certainly sort of raise it and at least make a distinction, I think, between pragmatic, practical demands that can be met within the status quo and thinking about the kind of transformations that would need to take place within the movement in order to meet some ends that may not be attainable today. So that distinction, and also this issue of capitalism. So capitalism, I think, was varied throughout. A lot of folks talked about distribution, fair distribution throughout. A lot of folks talked about the way in which the state the interest of the state are bound up with corporations, and so therefore they see a kind of, the state is one entity, and sort of capitalism sort of exists, and the question is, can capitalism not influence the state, which I think is a particular political imagination about how the state functions. Other folks talked about the encroaching upon democracy, and I think that, if I'm not mistaken, the way in which capitalism actually, because it is so, because it reproduces inequality, it actually obstructs democracy. And then Chris, brought in a historical memory of the early 20th century and the Second International, which is a very specific idea of capitalism, and I would argue it's the abolition of socially necessary labor. And these are actually very different types of political imaginations, meaning very different types of politics would come from arguing that capitalism is one thing or another. And I'm curious about how these are interrelated, or how one imagines them to be a force. And last, I think, which was how we started the panel, it's about building community within Occupy. The idea being that we can show by example, by sort of being the change that we want to see, the communities that are arising within these Occupy movements are the societies that we would want to live in. And I think that this is bound up with the issue of capitalism, but I would want to raise the prospect of, can one actually create the society that one wants to live in within the society that we exist in? Is that possible? Is it about different attitudes towards each other, or are there prevailing social limitations that one can't do away with, even if one has the space to interact with people in a fundamentally different way? It's really open for anyone.
Yeah, I'd like to just speak to that last. I'd like to just speak to that last point you just made. I think that's a really good point about how do we make the community we want inside of this oppressive community that we, or oppressive system that we don't like, to put it mildly. And I think that that's like a constant struggle and a constant challenge. And I don't think that we will, I don't necessarily think that we will ever get there. I'm certainly not going to see it in my life. But I think the idea is that we have this thing that we're striving towards, and we have this set of goals that we want to reach, and those dictate our actions. So I guess the idea is, I heard someone put it really well the other day, the idea is like in principle and not in practice. So like basically, you know, I'd like to think about it how with every decision we make, we can liberate or we can oppress. And there are times where, so in principle, I want to make all decisions that are liberating and build a community that is liberating. But at times, I make decisions that oppress, like, you know, a lot of the clothes that I wear, some of the clothes that I wear, I bought brand new, which means I bought them from people who made them in like unfair working conditions, right? So in principle, I'm like trying to work against that, but in practice, you know, I need to wear pants. If I didn't have pants here, I wouldn't have been able to, I wouldn't be here. You know, I would have gotten arrested. So it's a constant challenge, and it's something that we're constantly, I guess what I'm just trying to say is a constant challenge to create the society that we want within a society that we disagree with, and it's just, we're constantly moving towards that goal. And it's not about getting there, but it's about the process of getting there.
It's really open to anyone.
I mean, I just would like to make kind of another quick historical allusion. I mean, before he became the man we all know him to be, you know, Eugene Debs, who was the leader, the great leader of the early 20th century Socialist Party, was involved in a number of efforts to establish utopian socialist colonies out in the western part of the United States. And they didn't work, because that's not how you change capitalism. You can't just drop out and you know, build your own society within the interstices of the current one that exists and hope to, you know, revolutionize it that way. You know, it doesn't work that way. And on the basis of that understanding, you know, he and his comrades, you know, formed a party that tried to organize the working class and take state power in the United States.
Chris, can you say why?
Why? Yeah, sure. I mean, I guess in this respect, I kind of have somewhat of a I don't know, an old-fashioned kind of Marxist perspective. I don't think that you can overcome capitalism unless you change the mode of production, unless you change the relations of production that reproduce the system, unless you fundamentally transform the institutions that people find themselves in within capitalism. And this is kind of the direction in which I hope the movement goes. You know, instead of just occupying public spaces, which is, I think, a very powerful and has been a very powerful and brilliant tactic so far, you know, bringing that kind of tactic into the institutions in which people actually reproduce the system, you know, their workplaces, their schools, things like that. There have been some efforts in that respect. I hope they continue, and I hope that people come to the conclusion more and more that, you know, you can't just base your whole, I mean, it's not even a strategy. I mean, it's or a politics, really. I think it's an ethics or a morality more than anything else. That you can't just, I mean, yeah, you can't just kind of drop out and try to build your own community and hope that it grows and grows and grows and ultimately displaces capitalism. I think that kind of strategy, or like I said, not even a strategy, is fairly doomed to failure. Sure.
I actually don't see that as what Occupy Wall Street is. I mean, I see them as doing both. I don't see that as, I don't know how many people from Occupy Wall Street would say that they're just hoping to get bigger and bigger. I mean, I haven't, you know, obviously spoken with everyone there, but I think you could do, I mean, I think that Gebs formulated it as an either or. I mean, why not try to have the life you want, live with a different form of money, and protest all the things and have a party and all kinds of stuff, right? Why not do both? And I think that's more, I mean, I don't see Occupy Wall Street as a party yet. I actually see, I mean, it's a month old. But I'm just wondering why would one not want to try to make a better world for oneself that did not have, I mean, in some ways, I agree about in terms of changing the fundamental relations of capitalism and change. I mean, I really agree with the whole system needing to be changed, but I don't see why not to create a better world for oneself. That's just, yeah.
Don't all jump in at once, guys.
Okay, I want to speak to that point as well. First of all, I want to second that I think that it's a multi-tiered approach. I think that the current system that we're living under, when I was going through the questions, and it said, what would success look like? The first thought that jumped into my mind was a system that is built on life instead of death. Because at the moment, that's what this system is. It is a system that is built on death, and every aspect of this system, from the moment you awake until the moment you go to sleep, you're just constantly faced with activities that, because of the system that we're living in, contribute in one way or another to death of the earth, to death of people around the world, to suffering. I think that becoming independent of that system is essential. I think that, if we're not looking to build those communities that are not dependent on the system any longer, then I think that, the danger, the co-opting danger that everybody is so terrified of is much greater. But at the same time, I do agree also what you're saying about the fact that if you just kind of tune out and withdraw and, go live in the woods somewhere, this is not something that is going to change it. It does need absolutely structural change. I've been talking about an idea that I've had for a while that I'm hoping is something that can be worked on through Occupy Wall Street, which is a BDS movement within the U.S. And that's actually something that would involve, if you're familiar with the BDS concept of apartheid South Africa, that was used, and it was a boycott, divestment, and sanctions strategy, and now is being used to end the occupation of Palestine by Israel. But I think that something that could work in coordination with building alternative communities of mass boycott, the D for disobedience, civil disobedience, and S for strikes and stopping paying taxes. These are things that, could be part of building an alternative community, but also saying we refuse to participate in the current system, we will not participate, and we will find other ways. And then, of course, building from there, we refuse to participate in this is what we want instead, and we're building it, and we're already doing it successfully. It is possible to be done. So there's no reason to say that this cannot be done. But it has to be, it has to be approached from all different areas in order for it to be successful.
If there are no more comments, I can open it up. Yeah? Okay. Because we are recording, we would ask you to come up here for purposes of...
Yes, hi, my name is Susan Kirsch. I'm part of the Granny Peace Brigade, the Raging Grannies, WILF, and I've been active since high school, and I'm 68 years old. And I was a retired psychiatric social worker, and I trained social work students, and I worked my whole career in poverty neighborhoods in Brooklyn, where most of my clients lived in the projects, had very little options, both emotionally, certainly financially, but I really admire what you're doing. I've been down at Occupy Wall Street, but I want to know, you now have the luxury as young people, and I admire you tremendously, but there are people who have a lot of responsibilities now for families. I mean, it's very nice that, you're doing amazing things, and you have spread an idea and a movement and a challenge faster than ever happened. In the activist movement for a long time, and it's very admirable. But a lot of the theory doesn't help what do you do for all the starving families in the United States and in the world? So there has to be, beyond words and idealism and a tremendous sense of goodwill toward others, what is, in terms of what you're doing, is still a small cadre of people who have the luxury of doing it. But a lot of families, both, poor and even now middle class, that are sinking at an alarming rate, don't have the luxury of this beautiful thing that you're doing, because they're really fighting to survive. I'm not saying that you're doing it with a lot of money, you're doing it with no money, but you don't have the responsibilities often of children. And so how do you create your idealism to what's real about getting the world better for people who have different necessities of life that you do at the moment?
I'll jump in because I'm really, really glad you asked that question, because that is really the biggest motivating factor for me right now is, I'm a young person and I'm a grad student, I have spare time, but, most of the work that I've done in activism is with immigrants, mostly sweatshop workers and other workers, some with unions and also not in unions. And, the fact of the matter is, right, like, if you have a child or you are undocumented, you can't necessarily risk sleeping in a park where you might get arrested. Like if you're undocumented, you could be deported, or even if you have documents, you can still get deported for being arrested. If you have children, you have another life that is dependent on you, and you need to be there for that child. And so what we really need to be doing is finding ways to make this movement sustainable for all people. Make it a way that everyone can plug in, because the people who sleep down at the park don't own this. This movement is about all of us. It's about, more than the people who are sitting like up here, like our brother Jackrabbit said. And, and personally, that's one of the things that I'm really interested in finding to do. We've talked about this a little bit with demands, is that, we're not going to get there in one giant leap. We're not going to smash capitalism, the state, patriarchy, and racism, and homophobia, and all that tomorrow. It would be fantastic if we could, but if it was that easy, we probably would have done it by now. So what we really need to be doing is we need to find, this is, something I think we need, this is only me speaking, right? But I think we need to be finding ways, we need to be finding winnable victories that will have a real impact on people's lives. Dr. King didn't launch the Montgomery bus boycott with the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act in mind. He didn't even launch it with the intention of ending all discrimination in in Montgomery, What he did... He didn't launch it. Yeah, and he didn't launch it. That's the other thing. History is giving us one man to, make the narrative easy, right? But, there was a huge number of people who decided that one thing they could do that would have a huge impact on the community that they lived in was to desegregate bus lines. And in doing that, they trained and learned how to organize, how to challenge power directly in a real way. And the skills and knowledge that those people learned and the relationships they built carried forth throughout the rest of the civil rights movement and made a lot of real progress in people's lives, even though I'm sure most of us would agree that movement is incomplete. And I think most of the leaders of that movement would agree too. So I guess what I'm really saying is, we need to be finding, our Montgomery bus boycott moment, something that we can rally together on, that we can fight for, that will have a real impact in our community. And I can't remember which of the panelists said it earlier that was talking about, it's not like we have a frozen moment in time we're looking for. This is something that's going to be constantly going, it's constantly ongoing. So we need to, we need to fight now, but that's not necessarily the end point. Whatever we win now is a stepping stone to our ultimate goals.
Yeah. I actually think one thing that I would like to see a lot more of that is already happening is blocking foreclosure evictions. That could be, and that's already, Occupy Wall Street is already involved with another organization, so that's one.
Just as a quick piggyback on that, if you're all interested, at 10:30 tomorrow from the park, people will be leaving to go to Jamaica, Queens to symbolically start the reoccupation of foreclosed homes. So you should all hit that up.
Tomorrow night or morning?
Tomorrow morning, 10:30, Liberty Plaza, under the giant red sculpture that you can't walk under anymore.
Yeah, hi, I'm Martin. I'm a recent graduate in international affairs from the New School. And now a New York correspondent for Danish Public Radio. One of the things you hear a lot in European media is the comparison between the Occupy Wall Street movement and the Tea Party movement. I would like to hear your responses to that.
Just a real quick, a real basic way to respond to that is my understanding that the Tea Party movement accepts lots of corporate funding, and we don't accept any corporate funding.
That's a first target.
Well, I mean, I think
I don't want to gab too much.
I think that the Tea Party is also, like, there's a lot of people who are very unhappy. They're really dissatisfied with the status quo. You know, I mean, what, there are. That's why they're out there. I mean, I'm not...
No, I'm just thinking. I mean, the biggest distinctions between the Tea Party and this movement are that the Tea Party is very. First of all, it's very focused. Like you guys are up there talking about how it's you guys think it's a good thing that you don't have an objective. The Tea Party is very focused on lower taxes and small government. I mean, the T stands for tax enough already. It's not only is it very focused. It's very, very passionately pro free market, pro capitalist, pro representative democracy.
So you're saying that it has a direction, has an immediate goal, that you're making a contrast in that way?
Oh, of course. I mean, when they pressure representatives in Congress to do things, you guys. Like I can imagine you guys calling up, you're gonna say, yeah, I'm gonna stay in the park until I hate the police, until Israel is destroyed. I mean,
Okay, well maybe we can get some responses to that.
These guys say, okay, well don't vote for this big spending bill. I'm just saying.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, maybe we can have some people respond to you if someone feels compelled to.
Well, I'll start. I want to, first of all, you mentioned amongst the list of things that you think differentiate the Tea Party from Occupy Wall Street, you mentioned representative democracy, which, I think everyone here has been uniformly talking about representative democracy.
You were talking about direct democracy, where you bypass the representative. You're talking about like an Athenian style thing.
Right. So you're saying representative democracy in the sense that there are representatives that supposedly represent you, but then again, is that really representative democracy considering the fact that they're not representing you? Right. Now, I wanted to say something that you did not bring up that is a difference between the Tea Party and Occupy Wall Street is clearly the Tea Party is willing to work with and even be under the umbrella of the Republican Party, whereas obviously Occupy Wall Street is not, in fact is vehemently opposed to being under the umbrella of the Democratic Party. So, and we're not running Occupy Wall Street candidates the way that the Tea Party is running candidates. So they are completely a part of that system. Occupy Wall Street is outside the system.
Can I respond to that?
Yeah, please do.
Actually, one of the, maybe the primary objective of the Tea Party is to take over the Republican Party and push it more towards a fiscal conservative base. With the left, you guys had a very different, similar approach by the McGovernites taking over the Democrats. You guys used to have. Herbert Humphrey was the Democratic candidate in 1968. The guy he supported the war in Vietnam. He hated abortion. And then within a few years you have McGovern, who he was involved in the Henry Wallace campaign. He was just so radical as opposed to the other guys. Maybe not to you guys, but as opposed to any mainstream American political view, it really was. So the objective of the Tea Party is to take over the Republican Party, not to just be absorbed by it.
Can I just maybe add like a nuance point? I think these are very valid points that you're bringing up. And maybe it goes back to, Chris's presentation, and also just the question of the Democratic Party. I think that the concern that people raise around demands, right, is about these demands being then immediately absorbed into the Democratic Party, or that people's opinions about these demands, they'll think, well, perhaps the demands were too radical, and so maybe the demands that can't be met today are those that are going to be met by the Democratic Party, and that will turn a lot of people, I would argue, very cynical, turn people away from politics altogether. The same folks that voted for Obama then going to protest against the Democratic Party going to Occupy movements and then having to vote for the same president again. And I think one of the questions that a member of Platypus added to the last part of the questions that we sent you guys is about, can it be successful? And in part, I think that that question is about, can anything but the Democratic Party exist in the United States as being on the left today, which I would argue is not on the left. Because I think that a lot of what it being successful, just raising that would be sort of what it would mean, at least in the United States. And I think those comments may be sort of part of that concern.
If I could just jump in really quickly, I think the thing that I found I think one of the reasons why the Tea Party was so bizarre in a lot of ways, I think I just referred to it in the past tense, is so bizarre. Maybe there's a bit of wishful thinking there. Is that it was kind of a counter-revolution in search of a revolution. It was like, I mean, you guys probably remember kind of when it got its start, with that rant by that cretin Rick Santelli on CNBC, and how he was railing against supposed coming of socialism in the United States, and whether or not it was all these other people, whether or not be Glenn Beck or all these other people on the right, who were speaking as if, like the revolution had come to the United States and that we were on the verge of becoming a Bolshevik republic. It was kind of bizarre, I think, to witness this. And it was almost like, it was like almost this preemptive attempt at counter-revolution. I'm really interested to see kind of how the Tea Party will reorient itself, whatever the Tea Party is. I mean, the Tea Party, I think, is a very disparate kind of idea. We don't actually, I'm not sure to what extent it's a grassroots movement, or to what extent it's a AstroTurf movement funded by elites. I'll be really interested to see how it will react to the emergence of an actual movement on the left, rather than kind of this, phantasmic threat represented by Barack Obama, supposedly. I think that there is something of a danger of coming from the right if those of us involved in this movement, I guess on the left more broadly, don't articulate a vision for what we want and how we're going to get there. Corey Robin is a political scientist who's been writing a lot about the right lately, and he, has defined the right as a counter-revolutionary movement, that it thrives on being reactionary, and being reactionary and reacting against, movements on the left, and in very important respects, kind of incorporating and subsuming aspects that, or things that, kind of the animating spirit of those kind of revolutionary movements. If you follow some of the stuff that people on the right have been talking about, it's like some of them are thrilled that now they actually have an enemy to fight against. Bill Kristol was talking about how this will give the right a chance to articulate a new kind of like Reaganite vision for the country that can kind of capitalize on a lot of the fears and the insecurities that are animating the participation of a lot of people in Occupy Wall Street and all the other movements or protests that have sprung up around the country. So I don't know if that's really a direct response to your question, but yeah, I just kind of wanted to go. I think that kind of accounts for some of the strangeness about that Tea Party movement, is that it was kind of this counter-revolution in the absence of an actual revolutionary movement on the left. It was really strange.
Yeah, quick response and then another question.
I just have to respond, though, to this notion of Occupy Wall Street being on the left, because, when you actually go down there and you interact with people, I really don't think that a lot of them would necessarily define themselves in that way. I really think there's a very strong libertarian presence there, and no matter how you may feel about this, I actually even saw some Tea Party demonstrators that were... I'm sorry?
Please, no crosstalk, please.
Yes, there are obviously a lot of Ron Paul supporters involved with Occupy Wall Street. So, I may be more on the left, or, I've heard other people say that, but to say, first of all, to bring up the Democratic Party and candidates in the Democratic Party, I don't see how that's relevant, and even the whole notion of the left, I don't think is really relevant, because I would say if there's anything that unifies everyone who's involved with Occupy Wall Street, it's the notion that finance and private business has dragged this country down the tubes and the economy down the tubes, but that is as far as it goes. Other than that, it's a really, really wide spectrum of different ideologies and beliefs and convictions.
Hi. Thanks so much. This has been great. It really has. My name is Mitchell Cohen. I'm now a member of the Brooklyn Greens for many years, and when I was at Stony Brook University back in 65, I started, we had our own collective, Red Balloon Collective, which lasted about 35 years. And we did a lot of different direct actions and so forth. But when I hear each of you speak, I go, yeah, I agree with that. And then, yeah, I agree with that. And then, yeah, and only later do I think, oh yeah, these are contradictory or somewhat. So when that happens to me, and it happens at occasion, I have to step back rather than try and hammer out the correct line. I need to step back and say, how can I reframe this whole debate so that it's not a debate? How can we apply the consensus and other processes to this actual meta debate that we're having? So how can we reframe the question, for instance, of demands versus, and not make it a versus, living, setting up a base from which all sorts of other things can happen and live that way. And one of the ways, I know I've been there, Chris, I've been saying exactly some of what you said and exactly what other people have said, and I understand what that intensity is coming from, and I feel it now too. So what I try to do then when I reframe it is, what do we mean by demands? Who some people raised, who are we making these of? What if we take that same concept and say, okay, we'll make demands, but we make it of ourselves? Here is the demand we make of ourselves in the movement. We demand that we ourselves create a society that provides free health care. Or we create a society, whatever, so that it takes it out of the loop, the vicious cycle that we're locked in on. And so I guess I wanted comments on that, and also to realize that, I'm sure you do, I've been down there a lot every day and try to participate in general assemblies that I could hear, which is very hard. So there are weaknesses also to that process, as nice as it is to observe. So how can we, I guess, begin opening up? One of the things that we did, I hate to say this, I sound like my parents, one of the things that we did in the 70s, but we did, when we went from campus to campus, there's a whole troop of us going around the budget cuts in 1975 or so, is we all began organizing occupations of the libraries, occupations of space that they were cutting down, but instead of shutting it down, which is what everybody, we're going to occupy and shut it down, we occupied and opened it up. We say, okay, this is open 24 hours now, come in, the occupation, it looks the same as if you were shutting it down, except it's open. And that way, like if we were to do some libraries here or a hospital, St. Vincent's Hospital, or, if we were able to get that far, we wouldn't need to put out a press release with the demand. It would be obvious to, the demand is not needed. It's just there in what we do. If we could, sometimes we might need it, sometimes maybe not, but thanks. So I'd like some comments on that. Thank you.
Yeah, well, is somebody taking stack?
No, people will just come in.
Oh, okay. So, yeah, I think that's a really wonderful sentiment, and I think that really speaks to why I consider this I feel like we already have one, in certain ways. I mean, not the long battle, but there's been so many successes, so many victories, like small victories, that I consider to be in effect because of exactly what you're talking about. Like, what can we do that's revolutionary in this moment, at this time? And I feel that, when I first came to the occupation, I was like, well, okay, let's get some demands going on here. I want some demands, right? Okay, because that's what everybody was clamoring for, so let's give it to them. It's pretty obvious, right? We know what they want, right? But here's the thing, it's like, as I open myself up to the experience, I recognize that, what's really revolutionary is not demanding stuff. What's revolutionary is listening to people and expecting to be listened to. And I understand that there is this press to just kind of say, this is how things are. I will tell you how things are. But I have to tell you, I consider that to be counter-revolutionary. I think that people putting out their ideas of what is and is not right without listening, without taking the time to listen and to pay attention to each other and to give each other space is completely counter-revolutionary. And I see it happening all the time. I got to tell you, I think the most important thing you can read at this point is a guide to how to facilitate a meeting. Like, as far as I'm concerned, that is the #1 most revolutionary thing you can do. Because what does it say? What does it talk about? It says everybody gets a chance to speak. You listen. You actively listen. You participate. You expect people involved in the meeting to participate. And you give that space for that to occur. And I believe in people. I believe in what people have, that people are good. I believe that people have in their hearts the love that they want to share with the whole world. And that if they are given that opportunity, then they will share that and they will make the correct choices. And I think to impose what is the right thing to do is wrong. And I think that there needs to be a time and a space to open things up and to allow people to speak. And the right things will come from that. And so yeah, I think that's the demand that you make of yourself in that moment, is to be respectful and to be open to other people's voices. And that's the way that you listen to the voices of people of color or people of genders that are discriminated against, because you give that space and that time available to people. So yeah, that's how I feel about that.
Yeah, just to piggyback really quick off of what Jack Rabbit said, is I feel like when it comes to demands, it's as much as having that conversation and discovering what our demands are going to be through talking to one another. Because, in trying to bring immigrants down to Occupy Wall Street, I've learned way more than I have read in, countless books all this time, because I'm not an immigrant and I'm not born knowing that. And given the world that we live in, I can't learn unless I shut up and listen. So that's an important part of this whole process too. You can't be democratic without having a conversation.
Just really quickly, this is a serious question. How would we organize a system of universal health care for over 300 million people without using a state of some sort? How would we deal with the ecological crisis, which is massive and would require huge amounts of coordinated investment and social and economic restructuring, without using, an institution, something like a state or something resembling a state? It's very difficult for me to envision doing those sorts of things without that kind of institution. And I really want to caution people against elevating this idea of we are the demands we want to see, or we are the change we want to see, because I'll revisit kind of some of the things that people on the right have been writing in reaction to what's been going on. David Brooks, for all his idiocy, says something mildly interesting once in a while, and he ended one of his recent columns about the Occupy Wall Street movement by invoking. I think the phrase that he used, if I remember correctly, was "Let's occupy ourselves." And he raised this slogan, in the context of, we need to stop living beyond our means. We need to stop getting into debt. We need to stop doing all these things that are personal moral failings if we want to deal with the situation that we're in. I understand that people in Zuccotti Park are not saying the same thing that David Brooks is saying, but I find the similarity of the language and kind of the impulse to be frighteningly similar. And I think if people aren't careful about thinking about what it would really require to make the kinds of changes that we all want, then we're going to I guess get caught up we're just not going to get, we're not going to attain success. It will not be successful. It will be easily recuperable and will not frighten capital in the least. Capital can deal with people having feelings and experiences in a park. It can't deal with...
They can also deal with demands as well.
I'm not saying it can't, but, I just really want to caution people against kind of going too far down that road.
So Lisa, and then Jordan.
I think in terms of, I don't know that that be the change you want to see and we are the change you want to see are the same thing. One, I think, is an imperative, and one is, like, I don't know that Occupy Wall Street as it is in the present is the ultimate goal. I mean, I don't see it that way at all. I mean, I don't see, 400 people wanting to sleep on top of each other and 3/4 of an acre of concrete just being that, but not to, but I don't think that, anyway, that's just mostly what I wanted to say, because I thought there was just a distinction should be made there. Yeah.
I just had a quick thing I wanted to say.
Sorry, Jordan.
No,
Sorry. No, you go.
All right, cool. A couple of things I want to bring up just from hearing all this. One, I want to tie this in with the first question that was brought up about how do we integrate other communities, particularly communities who are not able to sleep on the concrete in the rain, of which my parents are a part, right? And so there's lots of people in my life I'm very close to who are not able to hang out in the park. And one direct way that we're trying to deal with this is I've been organizing with some people about doing Black Panther-style food distribution and clothing distribution in other communities through community organizations that support us and have street cred in those communities, with the only idea of doing that and saying, Occupy Wall Street is just here with this organization. We just want to have dialogues with people in this community, end of sentence. And just let the stuff flow from there. So we really can start to create a space where we learn from each other and start to build from the ground up the institutions that we want to see. It's a really good question. How do we build a universal healthcare system for 300 million people without a state? I have no idea how we're going to do that. And I think it's really important to look at it as like a constant experiment. And it's not like we're going to have no state tomorrow. It's not like the police are going to cease to exist tomorrow. But we are starting to develop alternatives, and I feel like all of these contradictory alternatives can work in tandem with each other. And I think that's what you were talking about with your question, is the very nature of consensus, is that, yeah, we disagree about things. Like, I don't think we should have demands. You think we should have demands. We can be part of the same crew because what we're fundamentally based on is creating a system where people's needs are met and that is based on like love and respect for one another. We're consistently just trying to create more dialogue, and it's less about us creating the space for other people to have dialogue, but us asking permission to be involved in their dialogue, right? So there's a there's a General Assembly in the Bronx tomorrow. There was one last week. I'm not sure how, I think this is the second one in the Bronx, the third one in the Bronx, right? And Brooklyn has one too, right? So these are communities that aren't at Occupy Wall Street, but people are starting to engage. And I guess the last thing I want to say is that I have a lot of faith in this process, and maybe I'm like the equivalent of like a hardcore Christian or something like that. But I have a lot of faith in the consensus process. The General Assembly, as it stands right now, I think is a poor example of it, and I think there are other models of building consensus that work more efficiently. But the point is, I think that in our society, we are systematically taught from day one to look for leaders, to look for people to kind of take control, rather than us taking control and responsibility ourselves, and rather than us like working together in a group collectively where we can all satisfy all of our needs. And what the consensus process does is begin the revolutionary education of all of us being responsible for our society, all of us being responsible for our decisions, and all of us caring about each other. So I'm really excited about sharing that process with lots of other people and finding out the ways in which I exclude people from that process even as I try to include them, because I know that that's happening, because I'm a young white man and the most privileged person in the country. So I think it's a really slow process, and it's going to take a long, long, long time, but that's I don't know, that's kind of what all this makes me think of.
I think I want to continue the questions, and maybe the answers can embody the spirit of what you're thinking.
I see sort of a fundamental play, something that Pam, hi, my name is Lori, I am a Marxist, I'm a member of Platypus.
Welcome.
Hello. And I'm conflated here. I see that this sort of argument is walking around sort of, again, I will bring sort of the specter of historical experience that Chris Maciano has put on the table, which is the oldest debate, at least on the left in the 20th century. It was sort of the reform versus revolution debate. And the question in the early 20th century, sort of what seemed to have been victorious, was the reformist debate that it argued, the quote is, the movement is everything, the goal is nothing. And I see that being regurgitated here in sort of different forms. And I am quite unconvinced by this because of its subsequent sort of historical failure to actually sustain any reforms. So the historical sort of lesson that we've had is that it's neither or, but it's both, right? But what I want to point out is that I am very unconvinced about the Occupy movement, and I see sort of a huge abyss between means and ends, not only means and demands, but means pretend as demands as means, and then furthering sort of ends. And those ends are attached to also how we understand the world that we want to sort of change. The understanding capitalism would be a way of approaching that, but also simply clarifying the point of any anti-capitalist politic. And I certainly don't think that I hear the potential anti-capitalist tones in the conversation, but I see sort of a satisfaction with the process and the means that you've achieved. That you really feel that you've succeeded in this process. And people are shaking their heads, and I really want them to. But those who might feel that they succeed in sort of just because of communication being open, the question of voice, these are not the real problems at Capital. These are problems that have been there historically forever. So what are the fundamental problems of the present, beyond even just understanding being against Wall Street or finance capital? What are the real, like what I see is that the means are sort of being wrapped up in there as means as ends. And by that mean that the process itself of opening up direct democracy is a successful point, because otherwise people of color or women or lower classes don't have a voice. But I still don't think that this is actually reaching at what fundamentally needs to be transformed in society. What the fundamental, perhaps, spark behind the Occupy movement is. So I would really want to give an opportunity, sort of be like, really open up the possibility of furthering and understanding the ends of the movement, and making that as wide open as possible. So, you know, I will pass it on now.
I have, while I consider myself a Marxist in many ways, or Marxian maybe, I think that it's incredibly important to learn from the past and from the Second International, but I also think that we're in the information age, and capitalism is changing. It's different. The Second International, I think if we assume that the past was simply repeating it, it doesn't repeat itself simply. It repeats itself with a difference. And that's mostly what I want to say. While it's incredibly important to learn from history, I also think that there's some things that we're going to have to figure out for ourselves about the way capitalism works and how it can be undermined at this point in history, in this particular society we're in. I also don't understand how we'd have a healthcare system without a state. But I'm also not an anarchist. So that's, I'm not so much against having I think it's good to use the tools available. in terms of like, I mean, I don't think we have to throw away all the structures of state or whatever, but I think that we also need to figure some things out ourselves, because I think that that we've really, our society has really, in some ways, outgrown the state as it has been. And outgrown, in some ways, money, the way it's been conceived, and economics, the way it's been conceived in the past, in the digital era. Next.
One of the things I see that's most important about what we're trying to do at Occupy Wall Street is we are reimagining the way power is structured and flowing within a group of people. And this is something, I mean, I come from the anarcho-syndicalist, much more libertarian socialist side of things, so that's probably been apparent in what I said and what I'm saying. But, you know, a problem with using tools of oppression for liberation is that they usually don't lead towards liberation, And, we've seen this I think history has shown this. That's why we're having this conversation now, is because all the other times where we tried it, it didn't work out. And it might not work out this time. We were kind of setting for ourselves the hardest objective in human society, right? To change this fucked up world into a better one. And I really think that you can't do that without being both actively engaged in the struggle, and that means directly challenging power in a way that makes power uncomfortable, which Occupy Wall Street is doing in a sustained way, in a way that has not happened since the 1960s, And that's just fundamentally, I don't think...
How is power being challenged?
And power is being challenged by the fact that people have taken a space and re-articulate, and are articulating firmly, we're articulating our disagreement with power and the fact that we've retaken physical space and are not going away with it. They can choose, if you ask me, the best way to get rid of us would be to just ignore us and let us sit there through the winter and not pay attention to us. But that's not what they're doing. All we need to do is walk in the street saying our message and the NYPD attacks us. If that's not a sign that we're not directly challenging power in a way, I don't know what else is. True, we've not, caused billions of dollars of losses to the capitalist system. It's not being threatened and undermined yet. But at the same time, there is no force anywhere in the world that can do that right now. There's no organized left anywhere that has that capability. In the way that the only way we're going to build that is by opening paths of communication. That means both verbal communication through dialogue and communication through doing action together,
I was going to just add, first, I think this movement has to make a decision about if it's on the left or not, which I think, if that's right.
Absolutely.
If I may, could I open it up?
Well, I don't know if I've added myself yet already, but I'm not on the left. And the reason why is because of what we've been discussing here. Because, frankly, none of the reforms that you guys are advocating, or our Marxist friend over here has been advocating, can be possible unless people are willing to give up their private property, and people are not. Yeah, I can't see it ever happen. You're going to take the clothes off people's backs. You're going to take you're going to take their electricity, warms their houses away. Under the guise of saving the planet, you're going to control, what temperatures they can have on their thermostats.
Who says that? Who wants to take your shirt from you?
Yeah.
That person is a bad person. I agree with you.
Well, your friend here was just talking about how the pants he wears is probably from a third world country that he had. Well, the last pair of shoes I had it was from a country that has no freedom of speech, no freedom of the press, no freedom of religion. That country is called Vietnam. And it got that way. It got that way not because of communism. It's what it is. Frankly, it's.
You've now united the whole panel, probably.
Yeah, I know that, but the point is, I'm not going to give up my private property, my way of life. What are you guys going to do about it? Are you going to kill me? How can you force people to do this type of stuff without authoritarian state? And by the way, I come in peace. I really do. I'm here out of interest.
I don't think you got to worry about that from us.
All right.
I'd like to speak to that real quickly, and just finish answering your question about power. I think that we're not seeking to force people to buy into our ideas, but rather trying to create an honest space for dialogue where we can equally hear each other. So, like, I welcome anyone who wants to come from the Tea Party. I welcome anyone who works for Goldman Sachs. I welcome anyone from the Department of Defense who wants to come and participate in a dialogue with me about what I dislike about our society, and maybe, and we can have a conversation. And I think the fundamentals of what's going on here is that we're just trying to have conversations, and all of these solutions for things are really complicated. I can't imagine how I could live without shoes that were made in really messed up conditions, and that's troubling to me. But you know, we're really young, and I have faith that we will find better ways of doing these things, but it's just going to take a lot of time. And just to speak briefly about questioning power, Oakland, so for those of you who don't know, Occupy Oakland was attacked with tear gas and rubber bullets and were kicked out of their plaza. They marched back into their plaza, the same thing happened. I have personal friends who were attacked in all of this. It's a really intense thing. We had a solidarity march to stand with them the other night where we took the streets without a permit. We resisted arrest when police tried to arrest us, and several people, myself included, were pulled away from the hands of cops who were trying to handcuff us. We took the nets from the police when they tried to fence us in one area, and that is a direct challenge to power. Show me another time in the United States where the police say, I'm going to do this right now, and a bunch of people say, no, you're not going to do that, and then the police don't do it.
Civil war. That's
a really direct challenge to power, and so we're seeing that being built right now.
Well, I guess to respond to that, I mean, it's a challenge to power, but how is it a challenge to capitalism? I mean, there have always been cops. There have always been, forces of repression that people have struggled against. I don't really think that's the question that is posed or raised by the Occupy movement. And this gets back to the question of...
My name is Spiridon.
Okay. And I guess this gets back to the question of, like, if we're not on the left, if this movement ultimately does not define itself as a left movement, which I understand to be, a revolutionary challenge to capitalism in order to get beyond it historically, then what is it? And this is an honest question, because a lot of people raise, we're beyond politics, we're beyond left and right.
Well,
I'm still talking. Historically, that kind of formulation has very awful connotations. I mean, the kind of beyond left and right, ultimately comes out of the fascist movement in Europe. I'm not saying that anyone that says that is a fascist, but I'm just saying, I think there's just a lot of, and this is no one's fault, I think, that's involved in the Occupy movement, is that there's just such a lack of historical awareness, or just an awareness of kind of the history of the left within the Occupy movement. That's the fault of the 20th century left. It's not the fault of anyone that's involved today. But again, I ask, if we're not of the left, if we're not challenging capitalism, then what are we?
Yeah. Oh, no, you can comment.
Well, I'll just say, I do think that we are of the left. I will say that. At least that's what I would like. And I'm trying to remember what else I was going to say. Right? Anyway, go ahead. Yeah.
I wanted to address Lori's question, and I guess, oh, there you are, okay. But it kind of does fit in with what you were saying and some other things as well. But I wanted to talk about this notion of what are we for and what are we against? Because I feel like those, certainly have maybe some overlapping things, but I think that, what we're against in some ways might be more unifying than how we think that it should be done differently. So I think that, you could say, oh, everyone, that's what I was thinking about earlier with, I think everyone that's involved maybe is angry about the corporate or financial influence on government policy. And so that, is something where direct action can come in to say, okay, that's something that we all agree upon, that, we're angry about that, so we're going to do some sort of combative action, whether it's a boycott or whether it's a general strike or whether it's resisting taxes, that we can combat head on. But, when it comes to what we're for, I think that's a lot broader. I I think that, the way that people who define themselves as anarchists might be different than how people who define themselves as Marxists versus people who define themselves as libertarians, et cetera, socialists, whatever you want to say, how they would actually do it differently. So I was going to say this kind of fits in also with the idea of a leaderless movement. And this even goes back to the conversation earlier of, should we focus more on be the change that you want to see, or, structurally change everything. I think that, that's why the approach of having a leaderless revolution or movement, is effective because, having these working groups, it's like, yes, there's one working group or many working groups that are working on solution-oriented approaches of how to, do it differently and different ways to do it differently versus others that are working on, okay, we're going to combat head-on what it is that we're against, and we're going to find a way of changing that. So, I think that it needs to be a multi-tactical approach, and that's why I think that leaderless and with different working groups is effective in that way and can accommodate a wide range of different beliefs and philosophies and tactics and all the rest.
Yeah, go ahead.
So, I just want to say that I think conversation leads to a challenge to power. I think that, one of the things that I'm trying to get involved with right now is interoccupation communication. I was just thinking about, again, I feel like there's this rush to fill this vacuum. It's been a month. It's been a month and a half. It's like no time at all, and all of us, everybody's rushing to put their stamp on this, and it's just like, can we just take some time to figure stuff out? Seriously. You think that everything's based on history? It's like you want to talk about Marxism? Look, no, I'm not a history buff, but I also don't think that Marxism has had really great success either. There's plenty of things that you can look at, like this gentleman said earlier. Oh, well, look at Vietnam. Now I know that it's like hyperbole. It might not necessarily be, he may be overstating the case, but nevertheless, you can point to any kind of, capitalism sucks here, communism sucks over here, whatever. I think that one of the things I'd like to do is to really challenge people to be mindful of the fact that your rejection of certain things is actually an attachment to it. You're criticizing the fact that we're saying going beyond these definitions or whatever. Your attachment to the definitions is it's a desire for them. So I'm just, that's what I hear, that you're so eager to reject these things. It's actually what you're doing is you're holding on to them even tighter. But just practically, I just wanted to point out that practically, having a conversation is a way to actually challenge power. If there is a coordinated effort to do I've heard student loan strikes, just strikes in general. If occupations are coordinating themselves across the country and around the world, if there's some kind of communication going on about particular actions that can be held around the country or around the world, that's pretty powerful. That's pretty amazing. And I see that as entirely possible to happen. So I think that's a conversation, and that can lead to some serious action, challenges power. Just putting it out there.
I just wanted to say what I had forgotten before, which is that, I think that the knowledge of the left on the part of the occupiers and the protesters is varied. It's very diverse in terms of whether they have a knowledge of history or not. But I would challenge those people who feel that Occupy Wall Street does not have a knowledge of the left to come down and teach, actually, is what I would say. And please, I would really, I, as a former academic, would really love that. Because I think that the more, and I'm on the Education Empowerment Committee, or working group, or whatever we are, obviously I think that, education is needed. And so I would really, really welcome people, rather than just dismissing Occupy Wall Street. There are just so many people who are very, very, very bright and willing to have really interesting political conversations down there, that if you go down there and you teach, you'll have a bunch of really eager to learn people and eager to dialogue people. So that's my response.
It's about 9:25, so one question, maybe some last comments. Anyone feels really compelled to ask a question?
Okay, I'll try to make this really brief. I had 5 questions. So I'll just try to condense that. I did think, one observation quickly, I thought it was ironic that the Black Panther Party has come up twice as like a model, but ironically, like they were a hyper-authoritarian Maoist party, right? That like
I made a note that says cuddly panthers.
Yeah. I mean, that like, you know, used very much their work in the communities, their breakfast programs, et cetera, were tactical. Like they were explicitly tactical, and then they had certain kinds of other like ends and organizational models they thought that would achieve revolution. I don't want to kind of go into necessarily like all that, the failure of all that, but I do think that like it's important when we're talking about, my worry is that a lot is being confused. So definitely the reason that Occupy Wall Street appeals to people is because they have a chance to voice their concerns, because they feel like they're involved, or like being able to have sort of a political life that is otherwise unavailable to them, because like things seem to be disastrous, et cetera. Like a lot of what people have talked about. That seems to me, so any sort of political motion you want to make, you don't want to eliminate that stuff. Obviously you want to retain it and increase it in some sense. But that seems to me to be very different from, for instance, that saying that that equals consensus decision making, or that equals XYZ sort of forms. Like, again, the sort of historic, I mean, I don't know, if you read like Tocqueville, you know, you can have all sorts of like 19th century American political civic engagement societies that like voted by majorities, but wherein people were like way, way, way more involved in their civic life than they are in the present. So it seems to me that sort of like the question of, you know, how to keep people passionately engaged versus participatory democracy as like the way we should think about our life, that we should spend like 5 hours a day talking about how our sewage works or something, and that would be emancipatory, or consensus decision making. It seems to me that these are all sort of different things actually that should be teased apart. And the question of how to make people passionate about politics is not quite the same as those other things. Okay, sorry, really quickly, just one other thing, I guess. I wanted to kind of ask about the sort of the separation between the state and corporations, which I understand, but I actually worry is, and again, this is sort of the question about what it means to develop sort of the frustrations around finance that all of us feel, because like, you know, so there's a lot of hubbub right around like the Citizens United decision, around the fact that like corporations are persons legally. But let's face it, like it's not like before this decision corporations weren't influencing politics, right? And like this is, oh my God, the Supreme Court has made it okay, so now like this is horrible, right? And similarly, like the fact is what these corporations have made all their money doing is actually, you know, playing all sorts of interesting games with people's home loans. And so it's not like, you know, the corporations are these sort of like foreign entities that you could just sort of swipe clean and then you get like the good society underneath. The fact is like we're all deeply involved in the process, what makes these things tick. And so to think about transforming that would mean something, it seems to me, much more kind of radical and much more about, again, the sort of question of capitalism than specifically kind of what the role of the corporation is in the state. I mean, frankly, like, it's good that the state took care of the corporations to some degree and prevented like a big financial crash, because who would that have hurt the most? Not the people who can go to like Boca and, you know, take their retirement packages. It would have hurt the most the working class who are reliant on these financial flows right now in order to like get their food. So it seems to me that sort of the, you know, here's finance, here's the rest of us, just shoo them away is not quite adequate for, again, developing that frustration. So I guess both of my questions involve sort of how do you develop the fact that people want to participate politically? How do you develop the fact that people are sort of frustrated at the status quo and the kind of clear, you know, problems of capitalism, the kind of most apparent problems of capitalism? How do you develop those to make them more systematic, more radical, et cetera?
Maybe just fold it into, just maybe going again to your last comments, and just picking up perhaps in some of what that left off, the question of political consciousness and how this movement seeks to actually develop political consciousness. And if so, how? Because my involvement in this has been attending these different meetings, these different working groups in which there is clearly a difference in political sensibility. And, you know, everyone sort of knows that. People don't really talk about it. It's sort of understood. And in part, this has been an effort to bring out what those political sensibilities may be. because although I'm sympathetic to some of the politics that are part of Occupy, I also think that the question of what kind of fundamental transformation in political consciousness would need to take place to really even think about overcoming capitalism, that has to be like part of the work. If not, like I'm all for overcoming capitalism, but what are the means through which one does that today? I mean, Chris talked about the poverty of politics today. That has become an objective limitation on some of the proposals that I think are interesting. And so when other folks within the Occupy movement also have responses to things like demands, there is a rational kernel to that insofar as, does this movement think that the only thing that it could do is just replicate demands that cannot be met, and you could just have, again, electoral politics of Democratic and Republican Party politics. And so I guess let's leave it at the question of political consciousness, the left, Jeremy's question about finance and the state, and we'll leave it at that for you.
Few small.
Well, we'll have another conversation. We can talk about that then. So shall we go in the order that we started from?
Can we go in the other order?
Yeah, sure.
Pam,
So-
can I just add one more thing?
Sure.
Because I think it's a part of it, but I think the question of is freedom a precondition for liberation is kind of been avoided and danced around. Simply, maybe you're asking it, maybe you're not. But, there's the sort of hypotenuse in the room is Freud in a sense, like this is all, where is, what about the catastrophe of liberation? How is, I think Jeremy spoke, power problems not just imminent to capital also? In our terms of like clarifying our anti-capitalist politics, how can we also clarify how perhaps, I think someone said something earlier about certain human problems predate capital as well.
Okay.
So we're now going back
Yeah, we're going this way.
for any specific purpose to respond to anything we want, or?
Go last comments, respond to anything you'd like. Time.
Yeah, I think Jeremy's question/comment about, how, I mean, they're all pretty big, but I guess the one that I kind of want to focus on, because I think about it a lot these days, is how you deal with the question of people feeling completely powerless and wanting to feel like they have a voice and can do something with their lives, but yet at the same time create a process within the movement that doesn't make for endless meetings. Like, I mean, I find that to be incredibly disempowering. I don't want to be at a meeting for 4 hours talking about process or procedure. It's ridiculous, I think. I don't know. I think part of it, I think what could help in this respect is if, people within the movement realize that there are differences of political opinion and that it's okay. I find that there's just like such a bizarre impulse to like have everyone be part of like the mystical one, and that if you're the person there that it raises political criticisms about what's being discussed, then then you're dismissed as some sort of like wrecker, or like somebody that's just trying to reproduce the structures of domination in society. So I would really hope that as people in the process of, I guess, struggling, through this movement, realize that we need to come up with other structures that allow, that have, that can kind of reconcile the representation with direct participation. I would like for us to go in that direction. I don't know quite how to do that. I hope that would just be a discussion that we can have within the movement. And I just, it's strange. I feel like, it's like no one that comes up with a criticism of the movement is dismissing it. I encounter this all the time. These criticisms are made from within the movement. They're imminent criticisms. No one's dismissing it. I love the fact that this exists. It's like the only hopeful thing that happened to me in my life. I was born in 1982 in the midst of the Reagan recession. This is great. It's okay to disagree. It's okay to have representation. It's okay, people. It's really okay. Yeah. I hope we can just adopt structures that, allow for accountability and transparency, because there aren't any now, and that I hope, will give people a sense that they can participate without having to spend countless hours at meetings, because that shuts a lot of people out too. Yeah.
Can I just add a point of information on that directly?
Sure.
I've been involved in the structure working group discussions about the spokes council proposal, so that's exactly what we're talking about.
Yeah, I want to say that I was, I was born in 1967, so child of Roosevelt Democrats born after the Summer of Love. But this is the most exciting political thing I've seen in my life, and probably the only real manifestation of people power. I mean, I don't remember most of the 60s. But that's just, although I've read quite a bit about it, but just that the diversity of this movement is really, really exciting. The fact that it's happening in tiny towns as well as in big cities is very, very exciting to me. The fact that, I'm blogging, and like the mom of a high school student is writing to me and saying her son wants to form an Occupy group at his high school to support Occupy Wall Street, and she wants to support him in doing this, right? It's just great how just the breadth of the coalition that's forming and the number of people who are coming together is very, very exciting to me, and the fact that people are just coming and taking the streets. It's really and occupying. It's great. So, thank you.
Yeah, I think that it seems bizarre that there's all this process and that things are such a mess at times, because I feel like one of the reasons why it seems so bizarre to us is because we have privilege, because we have the privilege to speak, because we feel empowered with the privilege to speak. And so it seems odd that people would be so excited about speaking and just speak. It's like, I'm moderating the politics and electoral reform working group forum on the GA website, and I'm barraged by people who just have these endless diatribes about how they're going to save the world, and where have I been all this time? And I maintain that is because to a person, we do not think that we get to be listened to. We don't, our opinion does not matter, and that is so pervasive. And the thing is that I think that for people who are traditionally minorities, minority populations, they're used to they don't expect to be listened to anyway. That's why they don't take part in society, because they don't think society has anything to offer them. They're not listened to. That's default for them. That's why they're not participating. That's not why they're not being a part of it. So what we're starting to see now is that, wait a minute, even people who are used to having privilege, the privilege of a voice, that's what I think the privilege comes down to. It's about the privilege to be able to get your voice heard. Even those people are kind of starting to realize, actually, my voice doesn't matter after all. Even though I thought it did, it's really not. And so they're that's where all this process is coming from. And I think that what it's really leading to, why I continue to maintain that it's so revolutionary, I'm not talking about voice. When I say voice, I want to be clear. I'm not talking about one of these kind of cry sessions. I'm not talking about how I lost my blanket when I was a little baby and I've never gotten over it. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is, you have 2 minutes to respond to this person, and everybody has the same 2 minutes, and we're going to go around, we're going to take stack, and everybody's going to get an opportunity to speak for those 2 minutes, and you're not going to interrupt them. You don't have an opportunity. It doesn't matter that you like to talk. You're a talker. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter you're somebody who doesn't like to talk. You're expected to speak, and I consider that to be pretty revolutionary, So anyway, and I do feel, I don't have a particular, I don't have a plan on how that is going to lead directly to the overthrow of capitalism. But what I do believe is that if capitalism inherently is unequal, then by being part of a process that really kind of emphasizes equality, you can't help but get rid of capitalism. You can't help but see, bye-bye, we don't need you, because we have other plans for ourselves. So And finally, thank you so much. And thank you very much to the Platypus Society for having us.
So first of all, I just want to thoroughly agree with everything that Jack Rabbit was saying about having a voice in terms of political consciousness. I definitely agree that that really is at the root of so much of the apathy, is simply the fact that why bother if you feel like you don't have a voice that's not only going to be heard but actually going to be responded to. Because I think that is, those are two very distinct things, not only heard but that there's actually going to be a response. So, I think that this sort of participatory environment, which I was going to say, it's kind of interesting because I see the society at large heading more in that direction anyway because of the invention of the internet. Because now it's like, there are so many more voices and we have access to hear so many more voices. And so this is kind of like, at large, we have the societal trend moving towards decentralization and multiplicity of voices, and then, this movement really reflects and engages in that, which I think is really beautiful. So I think that combined with, again, what I was saying before of just, feeling the effects of what's going on economically and environmentally and, in so many different aspects in your own life is something that is going to raise your political consciousness whether you want it to or not, because it's about survival and it's about being able to live your life without feeling under assault all the time. I really wanted to specifically address the issue of the separation of corporation and state. Some really interesting points were brought up about that. The Citizens United overturning, I think that was really important that was brought up in the way that it was brought up, because yes, that may be the pinnacle of corporate entitlement to do whatever the hell it wants, but it's certainly, repealing that is not going to stop that from being the case. And I think that focusing on those goals, as being like a sort of, concrete demand, I definitely see the rationale behind it, obviously, but at the same time, I do think there's a danger in it, because I think that there's a tendency in this country to kind of want to abdicate responsibility of continuing any sort of long-term movement or long-term pressure of, oh, well, we got Bush out of office, now we have Obama, so everything's going to be fine. Oh, well, we repealed Citizens United, so no more corporate personhood, everything's going to be fine. And I think that's very dangerous. So, I think that, looking at it in a much deeper perspective of how deep do those roots really run of the corporate influence on the state is absolutely essential. I would say, we could be looking at a constitutional amendment that mandates that those things are separate, that if it can be legally proven that corporations are influencing state policy, that is something that would be illegal. So that's one way of doing it, but there could be others as well. I also wanted to bring up the issue of the bailouts, because, of course, as the speaker mentioned, that with the bailouts, if the banks hadn't been bailed out, everything would have collapsed even worse than it did, and people would have suffered even more than they have. Well, first of all, those basic necessities people are struggling with. People literally in this country are, en masse made homeless through this, en masse unable to afford basic necessities, basic food, basic things. So, how much did those bailouts really cushion everyone at large? The second thing, though, is a lot of people said this right after the bailouts, and I think that it really is this simple. Yeah, where's our bailout? Why give that money to the banks? Why not invest that directly into social programs? Why, go through this indirect route of, it has to go through the banking system? I mean, this, again, indicates the stranglehold that capitalism has over this country. And I'm going to bring up one more point before we move on that, which is, a lot of the banks will defend themselves by saying, oh, but we paid that money back. Well, did any of us see that money? They may have paid it back to the government, but did it reach us in any way? Where is that money now? It went to the government supposedly, and then what? I really kind of would throw that out the window to say that, that was the right thing to do. I can't speak for everyone at Occupy Wall Street, but I would say probably a lot of people would share that opinion that it was not the right thing to do with the bailouts. Okay.
I guess for my closing remarks, I'm going to return to some of the stuff that, we've all been talking about really this whole time. Surprise, surprise, right? Really, I think the way that we're going to learn how to solve the problems that we've been articulating tonight and function in a democratic society is that we really first have to do that. We have to learn how to do it. We weren't born learning how to function in the society we live in now. We were socialized to learn all the rules and mores that we follow, and we have to re-socialize ourselves to live in a way where we treat one another as equals, where we have dialogue, where the idea of democracy isn't winning everyone over to your position, but to arriving at a position that everyone can agree on. I've been active in consensus-based organizing structures since I was 18. So, going to a meeting and having the idea that when someone else has said something that I want to say for the sake of having an efficient meeting, I shouldn't say it because I'm just repeating what we already know. I was at one meeting where we spent 2 hours talking about how our issues are structure and transparency at Occupy Wall Street before we started the agenda, because everyone had to go through and share their specific story as to why they had a problem with structure and transparency, when we knew that that was the purpose behind the whole meeting. And the reason I'm bringing this up, right, is Chris is absolutely right. That is not sustainable. I come from a union organizing background, and I had to learn that if I wanted to be able to have people who have real lives and families and other concerns to be active, I had to have a meeting that lasted a fucking hour and got some business done, And so and that meant that I also had to help people as an organizer who were coming to these meetings, my workers, that we all have great ideas, all of us do, and all of our ideas are valid and all of our voices are valid on every given issue, but that doesn't mean that we have to share it with every single issue and every single meeting with every single person, We can have multiple conversations, and a lot of that comes back to self-government, which is, I really think, the revolutionary thing we're putting forward here is an idea that we don't have to have authority tell us what to do, but that we, working together, can come up with the way that it needs to be done ourselves. So we have to learn through practice. I've been at meetings that started out running 2.5 to 3 hours, and now we have it down to 1 hour and 15 minutes. Because people have lives, they have other issues they want to do, and they learn that we don't all need to say, yeah, we hate the war in Afghanistan, there's a reason we're all at this table in the first place, and we can focus then on what we're going to do about it, what kind of action we're going to pull, how are we going to organize, what groups we're going to outreach, things that have some practice. And that doesn't mean that, we shouldn't have grand philosophical conversations where we explore, history and we explore the many differences between different ideas, differences in concepts, our discourses. We need to flush all that out, but there's places for that, and there's also places for action. And I really think that the way that we're going to teach ourselves how to do that is by doing it. There's just simply no other way. So there's going to be a learning curve. This is a month and a half old in a society where, like Jack Rabbit said, most people have never had their voice heard. So we kind of at first have to understand that there's going to be a lot of people just so excited this is the first time that they're going to talk about something important to them and important to society, and actually have other people listen to them in a real way. In a setting that's not just you're complaining to your friends about something, but wow, we are here to do something together, and I'm sharing my ideas about an issue that affects us us all. And, you know, that was a really empowering moment the very first time it happened to me when I was in those settings, and I totally had that mind learning curve that I had to go through. 18, 19, 20-year-old Phil talked a lot more than I should have, and I still have that tendency, you know? So I'm going to shut up now, and thank you all for being here.
Cool, so in the interest of that, lots of you have already made points that I was going to make, so I'm not going to make them. Just a couple things I want to bring up. So the question was asked, how does challenging police challenge capitalism? If anyone here has ever been evicted, you know that the people who issue who carry out that order if you don't leave your house are the police. So they are defending capital in the name of making people homeless, in a really simplified understanding of that. Let's see. The way that capitalism exists today, in my understanding, is that it can't really be separated from the state that we have. So this whole no-state idea is an idea based on my inability to imagine a state that isn't controlled by capitalism, and maybe not by capitalism, but by like large corporate interests. And I think that the way capitalism exists right now really thrives on people not having full information, and it also thrives on creating needs for people, or creating wants through advertising, for lack of a better way of describing it. I feel like we're really captive audiences to lots of messages and ideas about the way we need to live our lives, and ultimately those are geared towards making us spend as much money as possible, and I think they breed a lot of fear and insecurity in people. Speaking about other ways in which we're challenging power, there's going to be a nationwide general strike on the 17th that people are organizing around. It's my understanding that's the first nationwide general strike we've ever had. Some people who are maybe better versed in history can correct me on that. So we've got that going on. The 4th is take your money out of big banks and put it in a community credit union day. So we're creating a lot of education around alternative banking institutions and encouraging people to take their money out of Bank of America and Wells Fargo and stuff like that. And on the 30th, there's going to be a big conference between the Department of Defense, Wall Street financiers, and aerospace investors, like people who build drones and stuff like that. And we're going to shut the meeting down. If you want to be involved, you should. I hope we shut it down. So those are all ways I think that we're really challenging capital and challenging the state. And also, the last comment is that there's a lot of good ideas that are coming around here, and I encourage you all to take these ideas out of this room and apply them into your lives, into your workplaces, and your communities, and to come down to Occupy Wall Street and help us all learn. A lot of people here are probably way better read in history than I am. So I really want to learn from you. So please come and hang out in whatever way you can and share your stories and share your experience, and we can all learn from each other. So that and to just piggyback on what a lot of other people have been saying, that we can collectively build an alternative. For me, that's the only way in which we're going to liberate ourselves, is by struggling through this messy process of building this thing up day in, day out. Yeah, and thank you all for coming and listening to us gab forever.
So just to remind folks, this is the first discussion that we're having. The second one will be at the new school in a couple of weeks. So we've started to gather some more panelists for that. And there's a free publication in the back and a sign-up sheet if you want to hear about events. So thank you for coming.